The origins of the Akkadian Empire are inseparable from the geography that made civilization possible. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the low plains of southern Mesopotamia, the earliest urban societies emerged more than 5,000 years ago. This region, often called the Fertile Crescent, offered a unique balance of challenges and opportunities. Seasonal flooding enriched the soil with silt, yet the unpredictable nature of the rivers demanded coordinated human control. It was here, in the 4th millennium BCE, that communities began to transform subsistence agriculture into organized systems of irrigation, storage, and exchange. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Eridu, Uruk, and Ur reveals the first indications of permanent settlement and centralized planning. Irrigation canals, constructed and maintained collectively, reflect a society capable of labor organization and technical innovation. Surplus production followed, allowing for occupational specialization: farmers, potters, metalworkers, and administrators. As agricultural yields increased, the need for record-keeping became apparent. Clay tokens, once used for counting goods, evolved into pictographic impressions on tablets. Around 3200 BCE, this gradual abstraction culminated in the creation of cuneiform, the world's earliest known writing system. The establishment of writing was more than a technological milestone. It represented the birth of structured governance. By documenting land, taxes, and temple offerings, early administrators formalized accountability and social hierarchy. The temple complex, or ziggurat, became both economic and religious center, where grain and goods were redistributed under priestly oversight. These temples anchored the early city-states of Sumer, marking a decisive step from village autonomy toward organized civilization. Archaeologists estimate that by 3000 BCE, southern Mesopotamia was dotted with dozens of such city-states. Each functioned as an independent political unit, complete with defensive walls, irrigation systems, and markets. Their prosperity was linked to the rivers that sustained them, yet the very dependence on water management fostered competition. Control of canals and farmlands often led to conflict between neighboring cities. Clay inscriptions from Lagash and Umma record the first known boundary disputes in human history, suggesting that organized warfare was as old as organized government itself. Amidst this constant interplay of cooperation and rivalry, the foundations of urban life deepened. Trade extended beyond local regions to the Iranian plateau, the Persian Gulf, and Anatolia. Sumerian merchants exchanged textiles and grain for copper, tin, and timber, commodities scarce in their alluvial environment. This long-distance exchange not only enriched Sumer, but also wove together a network of interdependence across Western Asia. Such connections would later form the economic arteries of empires yet to come. One of the most significant aha moments in understanding this era comes from administrative tablets discovered at Uruk. They reveal an early bureaucratic system that classified workers, rations, and production outputs. By organizing labor for irrigation and trade, these early city-states effectively created the prototype of government administration, a model of resource management that would later define imperial rule. The idea that prosperity required regulation, and that regulation required record-keeping, became a cornerstone of Mesopotamian civilization. Culturally, the Sumerians developed a pantheon of deities reflecting their environment. Gods such as Enlil, the lord of wind and order, and Inanna, goddess of fertility and war, embodied the forces that sustained and threatened daily life. Temples to these deities dominated city skylines, serving as both centers of faith and symbols of civic identity. Religion reinforced authority by linking earthly rule to divine will, a concept that would evolve dramatically in the imperial ideologies of later centuries. As these early cities matured, social stratification deepened. Farmers, craftsmen, traders, and priests occupied distinct tiers within society. At the apex stood the Lugal, or great man, whose authority combined military leadership with administrative oversight. These figures would become the prototypes for the kings who later unified Mesopotamia under larger realms. The emergence of cities, writing, trade, and organized religion in Sumer marks the dawn of recorded history. It was in this crucible of innovation and rivalry that the conditions for empire first took shape. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, the landscape of Mesopotamia was a mosaic of powerful yet fragmented polities. Each competed for dominance, yet all shared the same language of administration, the same gods, and the same dependence on the rivers that sustained life. Over the next centuries, these interlinked city-states would continue to flourish and fight, paving the way for new political ideas. The drive for unity, to bring order out of constant competition, would eventually give rise to a ruler who transcended local boundaries. Out of this fertile and fractious world would emerge the first great empire of human history, the Empire of Akkad. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, the plains of southern Mesopotamia had become a dense patchwork of thriving urban centers. These were the Sumerian city-states, autonomous political entities such as Uruk, Lagash, Kish, Nippur, and Umma. Each occupied a relatively small territory, sustained by surrounding farmland and linked to others through trade, diplomacy, and warfare. Archaeological surveys and cuneiform archives from these cities reveal societies that were highly organized, literate, and self-conscious of their political independence. The Sumerians had perfected the art of city building, yet they struggled to achieve stability beyond their walls. Each city-state was centered on a temple complex dedicated to its patron deity. In Uruk, the goddess Inanna embodied fertility and war. In Nippur, Enlil represented authority and order. These gods were believed to grant kingship, a divine right that bound human rulers to sacred duty. The temple not only served religious functions, but also acted as an economic engine. Land, labor, and surplus were managed by priestly administrators who distributed goods and organized irrigation. In essence, every Sumerian city was both a theocracy and a corporation, its prosperity dependent on careful management of resources and faith in divine favor. At the head of this system stood the Ensi, or Lugal, titles roughly translated as governor and king. Early on, these leaders were seen as representatives of the gods rather than independent monarchs. Over time, however, political authority shifted from the temple to the palace. The Lugal became not just an overseer of religious order, but a commander of armies and builder of cities. His power rested on his ability to defend irrigation networks, secure trade, and maintain internal peace. Inscriptions from rulers such as Eannatum of Lagash, who reigned around 2450 BCE, describe territorial conquests and boundary demarcations, the earliest known political propaganda in history. One of the most remarkable artifacts from this period, the Stele of the Vultures, commemorates Eannatum's victory over the neighboring city-state of Umma. Its carved reliefs depict organized ranks of soldiers, chariots, and standards, an unmistakable portrayal of early professional warfare. These depictions, paired with administrative tablets recording troop movements and rations, indicate that Sumerian warfare had evolved from sporadic raiding into a structured instrument of policy. The city-state, once a cooperative community, had become a political unit competing for dominance in an increasingly complex landscape. Despite constant rivalry, the Sumerians maintained a shared cultural framework. Their language, cuneiform script, and pantheon provided a sense of unity that transcended borders. They celebrated common myths, among them the tales of Inanna's descent into the underworld and the exploits of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. These narratives, preserved in temple libraries, reveal how Sumerians understood kingship, a balance between human ambition and divine restraint. The concept of the universal ruler, one who could bring all lands under a single authority, appears first in this literature, foreshadowing the ambitions of later emperors. Economically, the Sumerian cities were interdependent. Each specialized in certain crafts and exchanged surplus goods through long-distance trade. The demand for raw materials, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and cedar from Lebanon, fostered caravan and riverine networks that stretched across the Near East. Administrative tablets from Uruk and Lagash detail shipments of grain, textiles, and metals, recorded with precision that implies advanced accounting systems. These records demonstrate how economic interconnection, once established, encouraged political centralization, Control over trade meant control over wealth and influence. Yet the very mechanisms that fueled prosperity also bred conflict. Water, the foundation of life in Mesopotamia, was both shared and contested. The canals that linked cities could be redirected or blocked, turning irrigation systems into instruments of power. The recurring disputes between Lagash and Umma over boundary canals are among the earliest documented examples of interstate conflict. The inscriptions that record these wars are not only historical accounts, but reflections of a fundamental truth. In managing shared resources, cooperation and coercion existed side by side. This dynamic would later define the strategies of larger empires. The late early dynastic period, between roughly 2600 and 2350 BCE, represents both the zenith and the vulnerability of the Sumerian city-state system. Urban populations grew, monumental architecture flourished, and trade expanded. Yet no city achieved lasting supremacy. Temporary alliances formed and dissolved. Wars were frequent but inconclusive. This political fragmentation created a vacuum of authority that invited the rise of more ambitious rulers capable of thinking beyond local loyalties. In this turbulent environment appeared Lugalzagizi of Umma, a figure who momentarily succeeded where others had failed. By uniting several Sumerian cities under his rule around 2350 BCE, he established the first attempt at regional hegemony in Mesopotamia. His inscriptions claimed dominion from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, though such claims were likely exaggerated. Nonetheless, Lugalzagizi's achievements revealed the potential and the fragility of unification in a region accustomed to independence. His reign was brief, and his fall would usher in a new era. From the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, beyond the traditional Sumerian centers, another power was emerging. Its leaders spoke a related but distinct Semitic language and envisioned unity not as a temporary coalition, but as a permanent system of control. The Sumerian city-states, after centuries of rivalry and innovation, had laid every foundation necessary for empire, administration, warfare, trade, and ideology. All that remained was a ruler capable of binding them together. That ruler would soon appear, Sargon of Akkad. While the Sumerian city-states flourished in the southern plains, a parallel cultural and linguistic current developed to the north. The people who would later call themselves Akkadians occupied the central and northern regions of Mesopotamia, an area stretching roughly from Kish to Mari along the middle Euphrates. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that they were Semitic-speaking populations who had lived among the Sumerians for centuries. Rather than outsiders, they were part of the same interconnected landscape, trading, intermarrying, and adopting many of the cultural practices of their southern neighbors. The Akkadian language belonged to the Semitic family, related to later tongues such as Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. It was a spoken vernacular long before it appeared in written form. As Sumerian scribes refined the cuneiform system, Akkadian speakers adapted it for their own use, modifying symbols to represent their consonantal sounds. The result was a bilingual administrative world in which both Sumerian and Akkadian were used side by side, Sumerian for religion and tradition, Akkadian for practical communication and governance. This coexistence, visible in the earliest bilingual tablets from sites like Ebla and Kish, reveals an important feature of Mesopotamian civilization, cultural integration rather than replacement. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, Akkadian names began appearing in Sumerian administrative records. This trend indicates gradual demographic blending and social mobility. Semitic individuals served as traders, soldiers, and scribes within Sumerian cities, contributing to their economies and defense. The presence of these names in temple and palace archives demonstrates that the Akkadian population was no longer peripheral. It was woven into the social fabric of Sumerian urban life. This linguistic and cultural synthesis created the conditions for a new, more expansive political identity, one that would transcend the older city-state divisions. The interaction between Sumerian and Akkadian cultures produced several significant innovations. In language, Akkadian absorbed Sumerian loanwords for administration, religion, and agriculture. Conversely, Sumerian texts increasingly reflected Semitic grammatical structures. This reciprocal influence gave rise to a shared intellectual tradition that would dominate Mesopotamia for the next 2 millennia. When Akkadian eventually replaced Sumerian as the primary written language, it did so without erasing its predecessor. Instead, it preserved Sumerian vocabulary and script within its own linguistic framework, an early example of continuity through adaptation. Another aha moment in understanding this period comes from the earliest royal inscriptions written in Akkadian. Found at sites such as Kish, these texts demonstrate that Akkadian had evolved from a spoken dialect into a medium of statecraft. The language's precision and adaptability made it suitable for recording decrees, treaties, and religious hymns. Its ascent from vernacular speech to administrative standard reflects both demographic change and the growing ambition of its speakers. In later centuries, Akkadian would become the international language of diplomacy across the Near East, used from Anatolia to Egypt, but its origins lay here, in the interaction of Semitic and Sumerian worlds. Material culture reinforces this linguistic evidence. Pottery styles, seal iconography, and religious motifs from northern Mesopotamian sites show both distinct local traits and southern influence. The Akkadians shared Sumerian religious beliefs but often emphasized deities such as Shamash, the sun god and patron of justice, and Ishtar, the goddess of war and fertility. This alignment of divine figures across linguistic boundaries suggests not conflict but convergence. In the centuries preceding Sargon, Akkad was not a foreign invader waiting to conquer Sumer. It was an integral participant in the same evolving civilization. By the time Sargon appeared on the historical stage around 2334 BCE, the distinction between Sumerian and Akkadian was largely cultural, not civilizational. The peoples of Mesopotamia had already learned to communicate, trade, and worship across linguistic lines. What separated them was not ethnicity, but geography and political ambition. This blending of traditions made it possible for a northern ruler to command southern loyalty, to govern through both Sumerian institutions and Akkadian speech. It was a union of language and administration that gave rise to something entirely new, the first empire in recorded history. In the centuries that followed, the Akkadian tongue would become the voice of law, myth, and diplomacy. Yet its earliest role, as a bridge between peoples, remains its most significant legacy. It allowed for integration rather than conquest, communication rather than isolation. This cultural synthesis provided the essential groundwork for what came next, the ascent of a single man who would transform regional interdependence into imperial unity. That man was Sargon of Akkad, the first to hold power not only over cities, but over an entire world of peoples and tongues. The story of Sargon of Akkad marks a turning point in world history, the moment when the idea of empire first emerged from the rival city-states of Mesopotamia. Yet, unlike the well-documented reigns of later monarchs, Sargon's origins remain partially shrouded in both legend and fragmented historical evidence. What is certain is that around 2334 BCE, a man of northern Mesopotamia unified the Sumerian south under a single rule and established a new capital, Akkad, whose name would come to define an entire epoch. Sargon's early life, as recorded in later Babylonian texts, is framed in mythic tones. According to the legend of Sargon, he was the child of a temple priestess who set him adrift in a basket on the Euphrates River, where he was discovered and raised by a gardener. The story closely resembles later Near Eastern narratives, suggesting it was shaped by centuries of oral tradition. Modern historians treat these accounts as political mythology, part of an early effort to portray Sargon as a ruler chosen by fate rather than lineage. Archaeological and textual evidence point instead to his probable rise through service in the royal court of Kish, one of the key Sumerian cities of the late early dynastic period. Cuneiform inscriptions suggest that Sargon began his career as a cupbearer, a trusted administrative position within Kish's palace hierarchy. This role, though modest in title, was one of proximity to power. It provided him access to military and political networks that were essential for leadership. The position of cupbearer, found in many Near Eastern courts, often combined ceremonial duties with logistical oversight, including the management of supplies and personnel. Through such experience, Sargon would have learned the mechanisms of governance and the weaknesses of the city-state system he later overturned. The political landscape of Mesopotamia at the time was one of constant volatility. The southern cities remained rich but divided, locked in cycles of warfare that undermined stability. Into this fragmented world stepped Lugalzagizi of Umma, who, through a series of campaigns, briefly unified much of Sumer under his authority. His reign, however, exposed the fragility of such coalitions. Inscriptions from his rule, including those found at Uruk, claimed dominion over the lands from the Lower Sea to the Upper Sea, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. But this was likely aspirational rhetoric. Real control was limited to a network of vassal cities whose loyalty depended on his personal power. It was within this unstable framework that Sargon launched his rebellion. The historical record of Sargon's rise is fragmentary, reconstructed from later chronicles, administrative tablets, and royal inscriptions. According to these sources, Sargon seized power in Kish by overthrowing its ruler, possibly through a palace coup. He then turned his forces southward against Lugalzagizi, whom he defeated decisively. Clay tablets describe Lugalzagizi being captured and paraded in chains to Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, where Sargon symbolically presented him before Enlil, the chief deity. This act was not only a military triumph but a statement of legitimacy. By subduing his rival in the sacred city, Sargon positioned himself as the divinely sanctioned ruler of Sumer. What followed was a process of unification unprecedented in scale. For the first time, the independent cities of Sumer, Uar, Uruk, Lagash, and Umma, were brought under a single central authority. Administrative tablets from this period record governors and officials bearing Akkadian names, suggesting that Sargon replaced local rulers with loyal appointees. His consolidation of power extended beyond military conquest. It required the integration of diverse systems of governance, economy, and culture. The title he adopted, King of Akkad, King of Sumer, reflected this new political synthesis. It was not merely a claim of territory but a declaration of dual heritage, Semitic and Sumerian, unified under one sovereign. A notable aha moment in understanding Sargon's success lies in his ability to use existing Sumerian structures rather than dismantle them. Instead of erasing local institutions, he incorporated them into a wider administrative framework. The temples continued to function as centers of worship and redistribution, but they now served the imperial state. The same scribal systems that had recorded temple offerings were repurposed to track tribute, labor, and resources across a vast territory. In this way, Sargon transformed the mechanisms of city governance into tools of empire. Cultural integration also played a role in legitimizing his rule. Sargon invoked the favor of the goddess Ishtar, whom he credited for his victories. In doing so, he aligned himself with a widely revered deity rather than a regional god, appealing to both Sumerian and Akkadian traditions. The use of religious imagery and divine endorsement became central to Akkadian state ideology, a theme that would intensify under his successors. The rapidity of Sargon's rise suggests both extraordinary leadership and profound social change. His military conquests and administrative reforms marked the beginning of imperial thinking, the belief that stability and prosperity could be achieved through unity rather than rivalry. The Sumerian model of independent city-states had reached its limits. Sargon's model of centralized authority offered a new paradigm for governance in the ancient world. Although much of his life remains filtered through later myth, the historical Sargon emerges as a pragmatic innovator, a man who understood that lasting power required both force and administration. His ascent from provincial official to emperor redefined political possibility in Mesopotamia. Over the next decades, he would expand his control far beyond Sumer, establishing trade networks and garrisons that stretched across the Fertile Crescent. The unification of Sumer was only the first step. Having secured the south, Sargon turned outward, toward Elam, the Levant, and the resource-rich highlands beyond. His campaigns would transform the regional balance of power and mark the beginning of Mesopotamia's first true imperial age. The consolidation of Sumer under Sargon's authority did not mark the end of warfare. It marked the beginning of empire building. With the defeat of Lugalzagizi and the submission of the southern cities, Sargon of Akkad embarked on a series of campaigns that extended far beyond the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. These conquests, conducted over several decades, transformed a regional kingdom into the first recorded empire in human history. Cuneiform inscriptions, though fragmentary, reveal the scope of Sargon's ambition. The Sargon legend and later Akkadian chronicles describe his armies marching from the lower sea to the upper sea, a phrase interpreted as the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. While some of these claims were rhetorical, archaeological and textual evidence supports campaigns that reached into Elam to the east, Mari to the northwest, and possibly as far as the Levantine coast. These expeditions were not isolated raids, but part of a deliberate policy to control key trade routes, secure resources, and establish a network of dependent territories. Sargon's success rested on military innovation as much as political vision. The Akkadian army was among the most organized of its time, built on lessons inherited from Sumerian warfare, but enhanced by centralized command and logistical planning. Bronze weaponry, composite bows, and organized infantry formations gave Akkad a decisive advantage over fragmented local forces. Relief fragments and administrative tablets suggest that Sargon's forces were supplied through a network of storage depots and overseen by appointed officials, ensuring sustained campaigns far from the imperial heartland. One of the empire's strategic priorities was the control of Elam, located in what is now southwestern Iran. Elamite territories held access to vital resources, particularly timber and metal ores, which were scarce in Mesopotamia's river plains. The Akkadian advance into Elam established garrisons and imposed tribute systems that ensured a steady flow of materials for tools, weapons, and monumental construction. Inscriptions from Susa and Anshan attest to the Akkadian presence, and Elamite pottery, found in Mesopotamian strata, provides archaeological confirmation of intensified cross-regional exchange. This integration marked a shift from isolated economies to a proto-globalized trade network under Akkadian supervision. To the northwest, Sargon directed campaigns toward Mari and Ebla, key centers controlling the trade corridors linking Mesopotamia to Syria and the Mediterranean. Excavations at Mari, located on the Middle Euphrates, have revealed archives that, though later in date, reflect the long-standing importance of this route for commerce in metals, timber, and luxury goods. Akkadian texts refer to ships from Meluha, Magan, and Dilmun, indicating maritime contact with the Indus Valley, Oman, and Bahrain. By extending his influence across these regions, Sargon not only commanded land routes, but also tied Mesopotamia into an expansive system of interregional exchange. The empire's expansion also had administrative consequences. To maintain control over such vast territories, Sargon appointed trusted officials, often his own kin, as governors and military commanders. The most notable of these was Rimush, his son, who would later succeed him. These appointees were responsible for collecting tribute, enforcing order, and ensuring loyalty. Administrative tablets from this period record deliveries of grain, silver, and labor quotas to the imperial center, reflecting a sophisticated system of resource management. The use of standardized weights, measures, and record-keeping practices across different regions helped to unify the empire economically as well as politically. A key aha moment in understanding Sargon's imperial strategy lies in his approach to integration rather than occupation. The Akkadian Empire did not impose a uniform system upon its subjects. Instead, it layered imperial oversight atop existing local structures. Sumerian cities retained their religious institutions and administrative traditions, while new Akkadian governors supervised from above. This arrangement minimized resistance and allowed local economies to function within the broader imperial framework. The policy prefigured later empires' methods of indirect rule, balancing central control with regional autonomy. Religious legitimacy continued to play a crucial role. Sargon's devotion to the goddess Ishtar, Inanna in Sumerian, was not mere piety but a calculated statement of divine sanction. In inscriptions, he attributes his victories to her favor and describes himself as her chosen warrior. By linking military success with divine approval, Sargon extended his authority beyond politics into the spiritual realm. Temples dedicated to Ishtar were built or restored in major cities, reinforcing a shared religious identity across ethnically diverse populations. The ideological fusion of Akkadian kingship with divine will become a defining feature of Mesopotamian political thought. As the empire expanded, so too did its capital, Akkad. Although its precise location remains undiscovered, references in later texts describe it as a thriving metropolis of monumental architecture, administrative offices, and warehouses filled with tribute from across the Near East. Akkad became not only the political center but also a cultural beacon, where Sumerian and Semitic traditions blended. The Akkadian language, written in cuneiform, gradually supplanted Sumerian as the lingua franca of administration and record-keeping, an early example of linguistic standardization as a tool of empire. Despite its strength, the Akkadian Empire faced the constant challenge of maintaining cohesion across distance. Communication between provinces depended on a relay of couriers and canal routes, and the reliance on local governors made the empire vulnerable to regional power struggles. Sargon's later years were marked by revolts in the south and uprisings in distant territories, indicating the limits of direct control. Nevertheless, his repeated ability to suppress these rebellions demonstrates both the resilience of his administration and the disciplined efficiency of his army. The Akkadian conquest reshaped the geopolitical map of the ancient Near East. By uniting territories previously connected only through trade or warfare, Sargon created a precedent for imperial rule that would influence Assyria, Babylon, and even Persia in later millennia. His reign marked the transition from regional kingship to the ideology of universal monarchy, the notion that one ruler could, in principle, govern the four quarters of the world. Archaeological discoveries continue to refine our understanding of this transformative period. Seal impressions, administrative tablets, and inscriptions unearthed across Iraq, Syria, and Iran testify to a network of governance unprecedented in scale. While later rulers claimed greater conquests, it was Sargon who first established the administrative, economic, and ideological foundations of empire. Over the following decades, his successors would expand, fortify, and institutionalize what he began. The empire would reach its greatest territorial extent under his grandson, Naram-Sin, whose reign would bring both glory and hubris to the Akkadian name. The conquests of Sargon brought a vast and diverse territory under Akkadian control, but military victory alone could not sustain an empire. To endure, Akkad required a framework of governance capable of uniting multiple peoples, languages, and traditions into a single political and economic system. This challenge produced one of the earliest examples of centralized administration in human history, an achievement as significant as Sargon's military triumphs. Cuneiform archives from cities such as Lagash, Nippur, and Umma provide insight into how Akkadian administration functioned. At its core was a hierarchy of authority centered on the king, who ruled not merely as a warlord but as the supreme coordinator of an integrated state. Beneath him operated a network of appointed governors, known as Insi or Sakanaku, each responsible for a defined territorial division. These officials reported directly to the royal palace, which acted as the administrative and logistical heart of the empire. The empire's bureaucracy managed a range of activities: taxation, labor conscription, resource allocation, and temple oversight. Administrative tablets record grain rations distributed to workers, lists of livestock, and inventories of metals and textiles, all standardized through a consistent system of measures and seals. This emphasis on record-keeping ensured accountability and continuity, even across regions separated by hundreds of kilometers. The Akkadians inherited the Sumerian cuneiform system but expanded its use from temple and city records to imperial governance. Over time, Akkadian, a Semitic language, became the medium of administration, coexisting with Sumerian as a scholarly and ceremonial tongue. The economy of the empire was fundamentally redistributive. Agricultural surplus from fertile regions, especially in southern Mesopotamia, was collected as tribute and stored in central warehouses. From there, it was redistributed to state workers, soldiers, and dependent populations. This system both sustained the army and reinforced the state's authority. Those who received rations were, in effect, integrated into the machinery of empire. Through economic dependency, Akkad ensured loyalty more efficiently than by force alone. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Akkadian system was its coordination of labor. Massive construction projects, canals, fortifications, temples, and the capital city itself required thousands of workers. Rather than relying solely on slavery or conquest labor, the Akkadians instituted corvée labor obligations, in which local populations contributed manpower as a form of tax. These records show early examples of organized workforce mobilization, overseen by supervisors and scribes who documented every stage of production. This process created a managed economy in which human effort, materials, and logistics were interlinked by written administration. Religious institutions, long the backbone of Sumerian governance, were absorbed into the state structure. Temples retained their spiritual functions but became administrative centers in their own right. The gods were now conceptualized as patrons of the empire as a whole, rather than of individual city-states. Sargon's devotion to Ishtar provided the ideological unity that the temple networks required. By aligning divine authority with imperial policy, Akkad transformed religion into a stabilizing political force. Priests and priestesses thus acted not only as spiritual mediators, but also as administrators managing temple estates and economic production. A notable aha moment in understanding Akkadian governance lies in its development of what historians describe as bureaucratic identity. In earlier city-states, authority was localized, tied to personal rule or temple hierarchy. Under Sargon, authority became institutional. Records indicate offices continuing across generations, suggesting that administrative positions, rather than individuals, carried legitimacy. This shift marked the birth of enduring bureaucratic governance, a model later empires would adopt and refine. To maintain effective communication across its vast territories, the Akkadian Empire relied on an organized network of roads and relay points. Although no physical remnants of these roads survive, textual evidence indicates the existence of courier systems facilitating royal decrees and administrative correspondence. This infrastructure, primitive by later standards, represented one of humanity's first attempts at a state-managed information network. Orders issued in Akkad could reach distant provinces within days, ensuring a measure of centralized control unprecedented for its time. Trade and diplomacy also played critical roles. Akkadian administrators managed relationships with neighboring regions such as Elam, Magan, Oman, and Dilmun, Bahrain, ensuring the flow of vital resources, copper, timber, and precious stones. Commercial tablets record the movement of goods under official oversight, implying that the state not only taxed but also directly participated in trade. The empire thus became an intermediary between regional economies, uniting the resource-rich peripheries with the productive Mesopotamian core. The role of the army in administration was equally significant. Garrisons stationed in strategic locations maintained order and secured trade routes. Their commanders, often members of the royal family or trusted generals, acted as both military and civil authorities. This dual function blurred the line between governance and defense, a hallmark of early imperial systems. Military presence was not simply a means of control, it also symbolized the empire's reach, reminding distant territories of their connection to Akkad. Despite its sophistication, the Akkadian administration faced intrinsic challenges. The need for constant oversight strained resources, and distant provinces occasionally rebelled or withheld tribute. Tablets from the later years of Sargon's reign record the revolts of all the lands, suggesting the fragility of centralized rule. Yet the persistence of Akkadian authority despite repeated unrest demonstrates the durability of its administrative design. The system had become self-sustaining, able to function even amid political turbulence. From a historical perspective, the administration of Akkad stands as a prototype for all subsequent empires in Mesopotamia and beyond. Its principles, record-based governance, centralized authority, standardized language, and integration of local structures, established a blueprint that Assyria, Babylon, and Persia would later emulate. The legacy of this model endures even in modern concepts of statehood. As Sargon's reign drew to a close, the mechanisms he created continued to operate, ensuring a degree of continuity rare in the ancient world. The administrative framework allowed for succession, expansion, and adaptation, qualities that would prove essential when the empire passed into the hands of his sons. The next phase of Akkadian history would see both consolidation and crisis, as the burden of maintaining empire began to test the limits of the system he had built. When Sargon of Akkad died, likely in the late 23rd century BCE, he left behind not only a vast empire, but also a delicate political equilibrium. His achievements had redefined the limits of governance, yet the durability of his creation was uncertain. The Akkadian Empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, was the largest political structure the world had yet seen. Its unity depended on the continued assertion of authority from the capital and the loyalty of local governors who now ruled in the name of Akkad. Into this complex inheritance stepped Rimesh, Sargon's son and designated successor. Rimesh ascended the throne during a moment of widespread unrest. Contemporary inscriptions, supported by later Sumerian chronicles, record a series of rebellions that erupted almost immediately after Sargon's death. The independence-minded city-states of southern Mesopotamia, long accustomed to autonomy, sought to reclaim their freedom. Inscriptions from Rimesh's reign describe revolts in Uruk, and Lagash, the very cities that had once formed the foundation of his father's empire. The young ruler faced the challenge of preserving unity through force before the administrative system could stabilize. The historical record presents Rimesh as a determined but harsh ruler. Clay tablets inscribed with his royal inscriptions, discovered primarily at Susa and other sites in southern Mesopotamia, recount his military campaigns in concise but revealing detail. One of the most significant inscriptions, known as the Victory Stele of Rimesh, records his suppression of the rebellion led by the king of Ur. The inscription lists the capture of thousands of prisoners and the confiscation of vast quantities of gold, silver, and copper. Although the numbers are likely exaggerated, they reflect both the scale of the conflict and Rimesh's intent to re-establish imperial dominance. The pattern of rebellion and reprisal continued across multiple cities. In Uruk, Rimesh reportedly destroyed fortifications and replaced local leaders with Akkadian administrators. These actions, while brutal, underscored a political reality of the ancient world. Empires could not rely on consent alone. Power had to be visible and enforceable. Archaeological layers of destruction found at Ur and Lagash correspond roughly with this period, lending credence to textual accounts of widespread turmoil. Despite these challenges, Rimesh managed to stabilize the southern provinces and restore central control. His success lay not only in military discipline, but also in the administrative continuity he inherited from Sargon. The system of governors, scribes, and tribute collection allowed him to reassert control once resistance had been quelled. In this sense, Rimesh's reign demonstrated the strength of Akkad's institutional framework. Rebellion could disrupt, but not dismantle, the empire's structure. Rimesh also continued his father's campaigns to the east, targeting Elam and its neighboring regions. Inscriptions found in Susa refer to Rimesh's victories over local rulers and the imposition of Akkadian oversight. The tribute lists from these campaigns include metals, livestock, and textiles, commodities that were essential for sustaining the Akkadian economy. These efforts indicate that the empire's eastern frontier remained vital to its wealth and supply network. Through these conquests, Rimesh reaffirmed the empire's dominance over the resource-producing highlands, ensuring that the core territories along the Tigris and Euphrates remained supplied. However, Rimesh's reign was short and turbulent. The Akkadian king list and later chronicles suggest that he ruled for approximately 9 years before dying under unclear circumstances. Some texts hint at palace intrigue, suggesting that he may have been assassinated by members of his own court. Whether or not these reports are accurate, they reflect the growing internal tensions of the Akkadian court, an institution now burdened by both wealth and responsibility. The empire's size made it vulnerable not only to external rebellion, but also to internal power struggles. A significant aha insight from this period is the emergence of the concept of dynastic continuity. Sargon's decision to pass power to his sons marked one of the earliest attempts at hereditary empire. Prior to Akkad, Sumerian kingship had been largely city-bound and often contested. With Ramesh's succession, imperial authority became explicitly dynastic, a precedent that would define Near Eastern monarchy for millennia. Yet the transition also revealed the inherent instability of dynastic rule. Legitimacy depended on both lineage and effectiveness. A king who could not command loyalty risked undermining the very institution he inherited. Archaeological evidence from the Akkadian period shows that Ramesh maintained and expanded the administrative infrastructure established by his father. Tablets from the later part of his reign record large-scale temple offerings and the management of royal estates, suggesting that the state apparatus continued to function efficiently despite political upheaval. The economy, while dependent on forced labor and tribute, demonstrated remarkable resilience, a testament to the enduring organization of the Akkadian system. Ramesh's policies also reinforced the ideological foundation of the empire. Like Sargon, he attributed his victories to the favor of the gods, particularly Ishtar and Enlil. His inscriptions frequently invoke divine support as justification for his military campaigns. This emphasis on divine legitimacy served to unify the empire under a shared spiritual framework, even as regional discontent persisted. In this respect, the Akkadian kings perfected a model of sacral kingship that blended political power with theological necessity. By the end of Ramesh's reign, Akkad had survived its first major crisis. The revolts had been suppressed, the frontiers resecured, and the administrative machinery restored. Yet the costs were immense, both in lives and in the empire's capacity for cohesion. The necessity of constant military intervention revealed the structural weakness of overextension. Akkad could project power, but it struggled to sustain consent. With Ramesh's death, the throne passed to his brother, Manishtushu, who inherited both the empire's vast resources and its underlying tensions. His reign would continue the process of consolidation but also expose new vulnerabilities, particularly the challenge of governing distant provinces while maintaining stability at the core. The transition from Sargon to his sons represents more than a dynastic succession. It marks the first test of imperial permanence in recorded history. Could a system built by conquest endure beyond its founder's lifetime? Ramesh's reign provided an answer, tenuous but instructive. Empire could survive rebellion, but it required adaptation, continuity, and administrative will. With the death of Ramesh, the Akkadian throne passed to his brother Manishtushu, Sargon's second son. His accession around 2285 BCE marked a crucial phase in the young empire's history, one less defined by conquest and more by consolidation. The rebellions that had consumed Ramesh's reign had demonstrated both the empire's strength and its fragility. Manishtushu inherited a dominion still vast but unsettled, its stability dependent on the delicate balance between central authority and provincial autonomy. His task was not to expand the empire's borders, but to ensure that Sargon's creation could sustain itself through structure, economy, and succession. The historical evidence for Manishtushu's reign is drawn primarily from royal inscriptions, foundation tablets, and administrative records discovered at Susa, Kish, and Mari. These sources reveal a ruler less preoccupied with warfare than with administration, infrastructure, and commerce. While Sargon and Ramesh had established the empire through force, Manishtushu focused on integration. His policies reflected an understanding that the longevity of empire rested not on conquest alone, but on the reliable management of its internal systems, land, labor, and trade. One of Manishtushu's most remarkable initiatives was a comprehensive land reorganization program. Inscriptions such as the Manishtushu obelisk, now housed in the Louvre, record large-scale purchases and redistributions of property across the empire. These transactions were not mere acquisitions of personal wealth. They were administrative instruments designed to stabilize the state. By formalizing land ownership under royal authority, Manishtushu effectively transformed the economic base of the empire. Local governors, military officials, and priests were granted estates in exchange for service and loyalty, binding them more directly to the central government. This approach established one of the earliest documented systems of land-based patronage, anticipating the feudal models that would later characterize ancient and medieval governance. The obelisk inscriptions also provide rare insight into the bureaucratic sophistication of the Akkadian state. They record precise details, boundaries, quantities, witnesses, and seal impressions, reflecting a legal culture grounded in documentation and accountability. This institutional emphasis on written contracts shows how deeply cuneiform administration had penetrated daily governance. Manishtushu's reign, more than any other, demonstrated the transformation of Mesopotamian record-keeping from temple accounting to imperial bureaucracy. Trade and resource control remained vital priorities. The Akkadian heartland was rich in agriculture but poor in essential materials such as copper, tin, and timber. To secure these, Manishtushu maintained and expanded long-distance trade networks established by his father. Inscriptions mention naval expeditions to Magan, modern Oman, and Dilmun, Bahrain, regions known for their copper production and maritime trade. These ventures were not isolated acts of exploration, but part of a coherent policy to ensure a stable inflow of raw materials necessary for tools, weaponry, and monumental architecture. Archaeological evidence, including Akkadian-style artifacts discovered in Oman, supports the existence of these trans-Gulf connections during this period. One striking aha insight from this phase of Akkadian history is the deliberate shift from conquest to commerce as an imperial strategy. Sargon and Rimish had sought to control by subduing. Manishtushu sought to control by integrating. By managing economic flows rather than merely annexing territories, he transformed Akkad from a war empire into a structured economy. This marked one of humanity's earliest transitions toward an administrative rather than militaristic empire, a principle later echoed by Babylon and Assyria. Internally, Manishtushu's reign appears to have been marked by relative stability. The administrative tablets show continuity in taxation, temple offerings, and ration systems. The capital, Akkad, continued to flourish as a center of governance and production. Artifacts from this era, such as cylinder seals and votive inscriptions, reflect the continuing synthesis of Sumerian and Semitic artistic traditions, a cultural hallmark of the Akkadian period. Religious life remained anchored around the worship of Ishtar, but Manishtushu also emphasized devotion to Shamash, the sun god and divine symbol of justice. This dual focus reinforced the connection between divine order and royal authority, suggesting that the Akkadian ideology of kingship was evolving from conquest-based legitimacy toward lawful governance. However, even a stable reign carried the shadow of fragility. The Akkadian Empire's reliance on a centralized system required constant administrative oversight, and the potential for court intrigue remained high. According to later sources, Manishtushu met his end through assassination, possibly at the hands of palace officials or military officers. The precise circumstances are lost, but the event underscores the persistent vulnerability of dynastic rule in early empires. Authority in Akkad, though absolute in theory, was still mediated through a network of powerful governors, generals, and priests, individuals whose ambitions could rival those of the king himself. The death of Manishtushu, after an estimated 15-year reign, closed the first dynastic generation of the Akkadian royal line. His leadership had not expanded the empire, but it had refined it. By systematizing land control, stabilizing trade, and institutionalizing bureaucracy, he laid the groundwork for his son and successor, Naram-Sin, the most renowned of all Akkadian rulers. Under Naram-Sin, Akkad would reach its zenith, both in territorial extent and in ideological confidence. From a historical perspective, Manishtushu's reign represents a pivotal turning point, the moment when the Akkadian Empire transitioned from a creation of conquest to a functioning state. His policies demonstrated that empire could be sustained not merely by armies, but by the steady rhythm of governance, documentation, and economic interdependence. The legacy of this administrative maturity would endure long after his dynasty faded. As the empire entered the reign of Naram-Sin, the foundations laid by 3 generations, conquest, consolidation, and governance, converged. What followed would be both the height of Akkadian power and the beginning of its irreversible transformation. The reign of Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon and son of Manishtushu, marks the pinnacle of Akkadian civilization. Succeeding his father around 2254 BCE, Naram-Sin inherited an empire that was stable, administratively mature, and economically integrated. Yet, he would not be content to preserve his inheritance. He sought to elevate Akkad to a position of divine and political supremacy never before claimed by a Mesopotamian ruler. Under his reign, the Akkadian Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, its cultural zenith, and its ideological boldness, defining an imperial model that later civilizations would emulate for millennia. Naram-Sin's name, meaning beloved of the moon god Sin, appears in hundreds of inscriptions and artifacts scattered across the Near East. Archaeological evidence, including the famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, now in the Louvre, attests to his military triumphs and his assertion of divine kingship. The stele depicts the king ascending a mountain over fallen enemies, wearing a horned crown traditionally reserved for the gods. This single image encapsulates the ideological revolution of his reign, the fusion of political power with divine status. Naram-Sin did not merely rule under the gods. He ruled as one. The early years of Naram-Sin's reign were devoted to securing the empire's borders and suppressing regional revolts. Like his father and uncle before him, he faced periodic resistance from the Sumerian south and from frontier provinces that tested Akkadian authority after each succession. However, his response was decisive. Cuneiform inscriptions describe campaigns against rebellious cities, which he subdued with both force and strategic clemency. Once stability was restored, Naram-Sin turned outward to pursue expansion beyond Mesopotamia's traditional sphere. His campaigns extended the empire's influence to unprecedented distances. To the north and northwest, Akkadian armies penetrated the Taurus Mountains and reached as far as Anatolia, likely to secure sources of timber and metal. In the east, Naram-Sin subdued Elam once again, reaffirming Akkadian control over its rich resources. In the west, his forces pushed into the Levant, establishing garrisons along trade routes leading toward the Mediterranean. These operations not only expanded Akkadian power, but also ensured dominance over vital economic arteries. One insight from this period lies in the strategic logic of Naram-Sin's conquests. Unlike his grandfather, whose campaigns often followed opportunistic patterns, Naram-Sin's military policy reveals a calculated effort to secure natural resources and communication corridors. By controlling highland passes, river crossings, and port routes, the Akkadian Empire maintained logistical coherence, an achievement rare in the Bronze Age. The empire's reach was now both physical and economic. Goods from as far as Anatolia and the Persian Gulf flowed into Akkad, enriching its capital and sustaining its military machine. Administrative continuity was essential to this expansion. Naram-Sin retained the hierarchical system established under Sargon and Manishtushu, but strengthened its central coordination. Provincial governors reported directly to the palace, which maintained strict oversight through an elaborate record-keeping network. Tablets from this period document shipments of grain, metals, and textiles, as well as standardized ration lists for soldiers and workers. The scale of this bureaucratic apparatus reveals that the Akkadian state had achieved an extraordinary level of organization, a true imperial economy. The ideological foundation of Naram-Sin's rule, however, distinguished his reign from all that came before. His adoption of divine kingship marked a profound shift in Mesopotamian political thought. Earlier rulers, including Sargon, had claimed to act on behalf of the gods. Naram-Sin claimed to embody divinity itself. His inscriptions refer to him as Naram-Sin, the mighty, god of Akkad, king of the four quarters of the world. This title reflected not arrogance, but an evolving concept of kingship, one that sought to unite the empire under a single cosmic authority. This innovation had practical as well as symbolic value. By portraying himself as a living god, Naram-Sin established a unifying ideology that transcended ethnic and regional divisions. Subjects from Sumer, Akkad, Elam, and the Levant could all view the king not merely as a distant ruler, but as a divine guarantor of order. In this sense, his self-deification served as both propaganda and policy, a theological solution to the problem of imperial diversity. Archaeological and textual sources also attest to the cultural fluorescence of Naram-Sin's era. The Akkadian language reached its maturity as a literary and administrative medium, and art from this period displays new levels of realism and symbolism. Cylinder seals show detailed scenes of warfare, worship, and ceremony, reflecting a growing sophistication in both technique and thematic range. Temples and monuments were constructed or restored across the empire, reinforcing both the visual and ideological presence of Akkadian rule. Yet divine kingship came at a cost. By elevating himself above the priesthood, Naram-Sin altered the balance between the monarchy and the religious institutions that had long legitimized Mesopotamian authority. This shift provoked unease among traditional elites, who viewed the king's self-deification as both unprecedented and dangerous. Later Sumerian texts, such as the Curse of Akkad, portray Naram-Sin's actions as hubristic, suggesting that by claiming divinity, he offended the gods and brought ruin upon his dynasty. While this interpretation reflects theological hindsight rather than historical fact, it underscores the radical nature of his reforms. Despite such controversies, the material evidence suggests that Naram-Sin's reign was one of prosperity and administrative strength. Trade networks expanded, artistic production flourished, and the empire achieved a level of cultural integration previously unseen in the ancient world. Akkadian influence spread through language and iconography, laying the groundwork for the international culture of the later Bronze Age. The success of Naram-Sin's system also highlights an important historical paradox. The very mechanisms that sustained Akkadian power, centralized control, ideological unity, and divine kingship, also rendered it vulnerable to overextension and internal dissent. The empire's efficiency depended on the loyalty of its governors and the stability of its resource base. As the empire reached its zenith, it also reached the limits of sustainable governance. By the end of Naram-Sin's long reign, Akkad stood as the dominant power of the Near East. His monuments proclaimed his glory across Mesopotamia and beyond, and his administrative system continued to function with precision. Yet the seeds of decline were already sown. Climate fluctuations, external pressures, and internal resistance would soon challenge the world's first empire. Still, for a generation, Naram-Sin's Akkad represented the apex of human political organization. The idea of a ruler who could command the four quarters of the world and embody divine authority became an enduring ideal. In later centuries, Babylonian and Assyrian kings would echo his titles and emulate his imagery, preserving his legacy as both model and warning. Naram-Sin's vision of empire, ordered, divine, and expansive, defined the classical phase of Akkadian civilization. The following decades, however, would test that vision against forces no army or bureaucracy could fully control. The concept of divine kingship under Naram-Sin represented a profound evolution in Mesopotamian political thought. For centuries, rulers in Sumer and Akkad had acted as earthly stewards of the gods, chosen intermediaries tasked with maintaining cosmic balance through ritual and justice. Naram-Sin, however, transcended this traditional model. He declared himself not merely the representative of the divine, but its embodiment. This was not a casual proclamation, but a calculated act of statecraft, an ideological reform designed to unify and sustain the first empire in human history. The foundation of this transformation lay in the practical demands of ruling a multicultural domain. The Akkadian Empire encompassed a mosaic of peoples: Semitic Akkadians, Sumerians, Elamites, and various highland tribes. Each possessed distinct deities, customs, and languages. Maintaining cohesion among these diverse populations required a universal principle of legitimacy. By proclaiming himself a god of Akkad, Naram-Sin provided a single, centralized focus of reverence that transcended regional pantheons. In effect, divine kingship became the empire's ideological infrastructure, the invisible architecture that held together its administrative and military systems. The earliest direct evidence for this new doctrine comes from royal inscriptions discovered at sites such as Nippur, Susa, and Tel Brak. In these texts, Naram Sin is referred to with the determinative dinger, the Sumerian cuneiform sign used to denote divinity. This was a radical departure from prior convention. Earlier kings, even Sargon, had invoked divine favor but never adopted divine status in writing. The deliberate placement of the dinger sign before Naram Sin's name marks the first recorded instance of a Mesopotamian ruler being deified during his lifetime. The ideological implications of this act were vast. By assuming divinity, Naram Sin redefined the relationship between the ruler and the governed. Loyalty was no longer a matter of political allegiance alone. It became a matter of cosmic duty. Temples and cults dedicated to Naram Sin were established across the empire, further embedding his divine persona within the fabric of daily life. At the city of Akkad, a temple was reportedly dedicated to his cult, suggesting that royal authority and religious worship had become indistinguishable. This new system also reshaped the visual language of power. The victory stele of Naram Sin, discovered at Susa and carved in pink limestone, remains one of the most striking works of ancient art precisely because it embodies this ideology. The stele depicts Naram Sin ascending a mountain, trampling his enemies beneath his feet. Above him, the sun-like symbols of divine approval illuminate his path. Most notably, he wears a horned helmet, a symbol traditionally reserved for gods. The artistic composition breaks from the rigid, horizontal registers typical of earlier Mesopotamian reliefs. Instead, it introduces a diagonal movement upward, symbolizing transcendence and divine ascent. Through visual narrative, the stele communicates the theological revolution of his reign, the king's rise from human ruler to God among men. From a historical perspective, this blending of art, religion, and politics served a clear administrative purpose. The empire's vast bureaucracy depended on shared symbols and narratives to sustain obedience. Naram Sin's divine kingship transformed abstract loyalty into devotional submission. It allowed provincial officials to act in the name of a semi-divine sovereign, reinforcing their authority while maintaining ideological uniformity. In this sense, the doctrine of divine kingship was both spiritual and systemic, a mechanism for governance through belief. One revealing insight lies in how Naram Sin's self-deification paralleled early forms of state theology. Much like later Egyptian pharaohs or Roman emperors, he used divinity not as a claim of personal holiness, but as an instrument of political consolidation. His cult unified diverse populations under a shared faith in the king's cosmic role. This synthesis of theology and administration marks one of the earliest examples of sacral monarchy, a political model that would reappear across civilizations from Egypt to Japan. The theological justification for Naram Sin's divinity may have stemmed from extraordinary events during his reign. Inscriptions refer to a great rebellion involving 9 allied provinces, including the powerful city of Kish. According to one royal account, the gods themselves granted Naram Sin divine status after he restored order and brought peace to the 4 quarters. Whether factual or propagandistic, this narrative reveals a crucial logic. Divine kingship was portrayed not as ambition but as reward for divine service. In Mesopotamian terms, Naram Sin had proven himself so effective in maintaining the sacred order, that he had earned deification. This ideology was reinforced through the empire's religious infrastructure. Temples dedicated to Ishtar, Enlil, and Shamash continued to operate, but their functions increasingly aligned with royal cult activities. Priests performed rituals that celebrated Naram Sin's victories and divine authority alongside those of traditional deities. The king thus inserted himself into the existing pantheon rather than replacing it, a strategic integration that avoided direct theological confrontation. This adaptability explains why his divine cult persisted even beyond his lifetime in certain regions. However, the same innovation that unified the empire also introduced long-term instability. By positioning himself as a god, Naram Sin implicitly subordinated the priesthood and challenged the autonomy of temple institutions. The temples, long independent centers of wealth and influence, now found themselves partially absorbed into the royal domain. Administrative records from later in his reign suggest increased royal oversight of temple lands and personnel, measures that likely provoked resistance from traditional elites. This tension between divine monarchy and established religious power would become a recurring theme in later Mesopotamian history. Archaeological evidence also indicates that Naram-Sin's divine kingship influenced art and administration beyond Akkad's core. In cities such as Tel Brak and Ebla, local rulers began to imitate Akkadian iconography, depicting themselves with divine attributes or adopting titles such as beloved of the gods. This diffusion demonstrates the ideological reach of Akkadian statecraft. Even as political control waxed and waned, the image of the god-king persisted as a model of absolute rule. The enduring power of Naram-Sin's ideology is reflected in later Mesopotamian literature. Centuries after the fall of Akkad, scribes in Sumerian and Babylonian schools continued to copy texts about his reign, some admiring, others condemning. The Curse of Akkad portrays him as a cautionary figure whose hubris brought divine retribution, yet the very act of retelling his story attests to his lasting influence. In the historical imagination of Mesopotamia, Naram-Sin became both archetype and warning, the embodiment of supreme kingship and its potential for excess. By institutionalizing divine monarchy, Naram-Sin forged an ideological template that outlived his empire. Later rulers of Ur, Babylon, and Assyria would adopt similar titles and symbols, blending divine sanction with earthly governance. His innovations in political theology thus represent one of the most significant contributions of the Akkadian Empire to world history. The recognition that power could be justified not only through conquest or heritage, but through sanctified ideology. As the empire flourished under this new order, its confidence grew, yet so too did its dependence on central authority and divine legitimacy. In the next stage of Akkadian history, environmental and political pressures would begin to challenge the very foundations that Naram-Sin had built. The empire that had reached the heavens would soon confront the realities of the earth. The reign of Naram-Sin represents not only the ideological zenith of the Akkadian Empire, but also its administrative and infrastructural culmination. Beneath the surface of divine kingship lay an intricate system of governance, a structure of scribes, governors, merchants, and soldiers coordinated across thousands of kilometers. This machinery of empire, refined over 3 generations, enabled Akkad to function as the first genuinely centralized state in recorded history. The administrative apparatus of Naram-Sin's empire drew upon and perfected earlier Sumerian precedents. Centralized record-keeping, taxation, and standardized labor management had existed in city-states like Ur and Lagash for centuries. What distinguished Akkad was scale and integration. Instead of multiple independent city administrations, the Akkadians created a hierarchical imperial bureaucracy centered on the royal court. Provincial governors, or ensi, reported directly to Akkad and were monitored by royal inspectors, officials known in later Assyrian parallels as qipu, overseers. This system allowed the central government to collect tribute, mobilize labor, and regulate trade across an area stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Cuneiform tablets discovered at Tel Brak, Nippur, and Susa document the administrative sophistication of this system. These records detail shipments of grain, metals, textiles, and livestock, often with precise weights, origins, and destinations. One set of tablets even lists standardized ration allocations for workers, a clear sign of bureaucratic planning at an imperial level. The language of administration was now Akkadian rather than Sumerian, signaling both linguistic and political unification. This standardization facilitated communication among officials and accelerated the spread of Akkadian as the dominant language of government and trade throughout the Near East. The economic foundation of the empire rested on a combination of agricultural production and long-distance exchange. The floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates provided abundant grain, dates, and flax, while the highlands and coastal regions supplied metals and timber. Naram-Sin's administration maintained strict control over these resources. Provincial records suggest that certain goods, such as copper from Magan and silver from Anatolia, were state monopolies, distributed through royal agents. By regulating both production and trade, the Akkadian state reduced its dependence on local elites and temple economies, ensuring that wealth flowed directly toward the capital. One notable aha insight from this era is how Akkadian bureaucracy anticipated later forms of state economy. By managing production, trade, and redistribution through written oversight, Naram-Sin's administration created one of the earliest examples of a command economy. This system, while rudimentary by modern standards, established principles, record-based accountability, ration allocation, and labor quotas that would shape Mesopotamian governance for centuries. Infrastructure played a vital role in sustaining this system. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that Naram-Sin invested heavily in construction and restoration projects throughout his realm. Temples, palaces, and administrative buildings were renovated or newly built in cities such as Nippur, Akkad, and Mari. Canal systems were expanded to enhance irrigation and transport. These projects served not only practical functions, but also ideological ones. Monumental architecture reinforced the king's divine authority and projected imperial stability. Each brick stamped with Naram-Sin's name became both a declaration of power and a mechanism of state presence. Akkad's urban landscape reached new levels of organization during this time. Though the exact location of the capital remains undiscovered, references to its grandeur appear in later Mesopotamian literature. Descriptions speak of vast storehouses, orderly quarters for craftsmen and scribes, and a central palace complex that symbolized the empire's unity. From this unseen city, royal decrees, tax assessments, and religious proclamations radiated outward, connecting distant provinces through shared administration. The military infrastructure of the empire was equally advanced. Naram-Sin's campaigns required a professional and mobile army capable of sustained operations across rugged terrain. Administrative texts record provisions for soldiers, including grain rations, textiles, and weapons distribution. The coordination implied by these records suggests a standing military supported by logistical planning rather than temporary levies. This innovation marks one of the earliest examples of an organized state army, a key development in the evolution of empire. Communication between provinces was maintained through a network of royal messengers and way stations, precursors to later imperial courier systems. These routes linked major cities such as Kish, Mari, and Ebla, facilitating both military and administrative control. Clay tablets found along these routes show consistent handwriting styles and seal impressions, evidence of standardized bureaucratic procedure. Such uniformity demonstrates how deeply centralized management had penetrated daily administration, a hallmark of Akkadian order. The empire's reach also extended into law and governance. While no complete legal code from Naram-Sin's reign survives, fragments of legal documents from contemporary cities reveal a growing emphasis on formal contracts, witness transactions, and written testimony. This reflects a shift from customary or temple-based adjudication towards state-administered justice. The use of cuneiform in legal and economic contexts reinforced the idea that the king's word, recorded and sealed, carried the authority of divine decree. In effect, written law became an extension of royal will. Culturally, the administration fostered a shared identity among Akkadian and Sumerian populations. Scribal schools trained officials in the Akkadian language and script, ensuring uniform record-keeping. Artistic motifs, such as depictions of the horn-crowned king or divine attendants, were replicated across provincial seals, promoting a visual coherence to imperial authority. This standardization of imagery and language functioned as a form of political communication, the empire's equivalent of a unifying brand. However, this vast administrative achievement came with inherent vulnerabilities. The Akkadian state was efficient but rigid, dependent on constant central oversight and uninterrupted communication. Any disruption, whether environmental, logistical, or political, could quickly unbalance the system. Tablets from later in Naram-Sin's reign show signs of strain, shortages of grain, references to banditry, and the reallocation of resources to military needs. These indicators suggest that the empire, while at its peak, was approaching its limits of sustainable management. Nevertheless, Naram-Sin's administrative reforms left an enduring legacy. Later empires, particularly those of Ur III and Babylon, would adopt similar systems of provincial oversight, ration management, and centralized taxation. The Akkadian model thus became the blueprint for Mesopotamian governance. It demonstrated that empire could function not merely as a conquest-based dominion, but as a structured organism, a network of cities, officials, and records sustained by the authority of a single sovereign. By the close of Naram-Sin's reign, the Akkadian Empire stood as a unified, literate, and administratively sophisticated state, a remarkable achievement for the 23rd century BCE. Yet beneath its ordered surface, environmental pressures and frontier tensions were gathering. The next stage in the empire's story would reveal how even the most advanced systems could falter when faced with the unpredictable forces of nature and rebellion. By the final decades of Naram-Sin's reign, the Akkadian Empire had reached a level of territorial and administrative control unprecedented in human history. Yet beneath this apparent stability, the foundations of imperial order were beginning to erode. The same centralized mechanisms that had enabled Akkad's expansion, tight bureaucratic oversight, resource extraction, and ideological unity, now strained under their own weight. Environmental stress, local discontent, and the natural limits of communication across such vast territory combined to produce one of the earliest recorded crises of empire, the Great Revolts against Naram-Sin. Cuneiform sources, though fragmentary, attest to widespread rebellion during this period. Inscriptions describe coalitions of cities and provinces rising against Akkadian authority, among them Kish, Uar, Umma, and regions in the Zagros foothills. The Naram-Sin year names, a Mesopotamian convention of naming years after significant events, record multiple years of warfare aimed at subduing rebellious lands. Though propagandistic in tone, these records hint at the scale and persistence of the unrest. It was not a single uprising but a wave of resistance spanning years, possibly decades, as local rulers sought to reclaim autonomy from Akkadian rule. The causes of these revolts were multifaceted. At their core lay the tension between centralization and local independence. The Akkadian administrative system, while efficient, imposed standardized taxation, labor obligations, and military levies across culturally diverse populations. Provincial governors, once semi-independent city rulers, were now directly accountable to the royal court. Over time, this eroded local autonomy and generated resentment among traditional elites. The replacement of local cults with the royal cult of Naram-Sin further deepened the divide. For Sumerian cities that had long maintained distinct religious and civic identities, divine kingship represented not unity, but usurpation. Economic pressures exacerbated these tensions. Archaeological evidence and later textual traditions suggest that Mesopotamia experienced environmental stress during the late Akkadian period, including declining rainfall and reduced river flows. Recent paleoclimatic studies, drawing on sediment cores and isotopic data, indicate a period of prolonged drought around 2200 BCE. This so-called 4.2-kilo-year event disrupted agriculture across the Near East, diminishing crop yields and destabilizing rural economies. For an empire dependent on grain taxation and redistribution, such ecological hardship translated directly into political instability. As food shortages spread, provincial loyalty wavered. Local rulers faced the dilemma of sending tribute to Akkad while their own population suffered. In some regions, particularly in the northern plains, evidence suggests the abandonment of settlements and reduced irrigation activity, visible signs of economic collapse. Against this backdrop, rebellion was not merely political. It was a survival response to imperial extraction in a time of scarcity. Naram-Sin's inscriptions portray him as confronting this widespread defiance with decisive force. He claimed victory over the 9 kings who had united against him, a coalition possibly representing both Mesopotamian cities and peripheral highland tribes. The victory stele of Naram-Sin may commemorate one of these campaigns, depicting his triumph over the Lalubi, a mountain people from the Zagros region. However, despite such victories, the persistence of revolt indicates that imperial authority was being challenged simultaneously on multiple fronts. The most remarkable aspect of this crisis is the ideological interpretation it later inspired. Centuries after Akkad's fall, Sumerian scribes composed the Curse of Akkad, a literary text that presented the revolts and ensuing disasters as divine punishment for Naram-Sin's hubris. According to this account, the king, angered by the silence of the god Enlil, desecrated the temple of Enlil at Nippur. In retaliation, the gods withdrew their favor, sending famine, invasion, and ruin upon the empire. Although clearly mythologized, this narrative reveals how deeply the events of this period resonated within Mesopotamian cultural memory. It transformed political collapse into moral lesson, the dangers of pride before the gods. From a historical standpoint, the Curse of Akkad provides indirect evidence for the scale of turmoil that accompanied the empire's decline. The very need to explain the catastrophe through divine retribution implies that it was both sudden and traumatic. Archaeological data corroborate a pattern of widespread disruption. Layers of destruction and abandonment appear in key sites such as Tel Brak, Nippur, and Ebla, dating to roughly the same period. These findings suggest a combination of internal conflict and external invasion, compounding the empire's crisis. One aha insight emerging from this period is that the Akkadian collapse was not the result of a single event, but of systemic overreach. The empire's efficiency, its reliance on centralized logistics, fixed tribute, and rigid control, made it highly productive in times of stability, but acutely vulnerable in times of stress. When environmental change reduced agricultural surplus, the state's extractive model could not adjust. Bureaucracy that once ensured order became an instrument of strain. This dynamic, visible in the Akkadian experience, would repeat throughout history. Empires collapsed not only from conquest, but from the failure of their own mechanisms of control. Despite the chaos, Naram-Sin maintained the throne until his death, suggesting that Akkad's core territories remained intact even as peripheral regions slipped away. His successors, however, would inherit an empire exhausted by war and environmental decline. The cumulative effect of years of rebellion, resource scarcity, and administrative overextension left the once mighty empire weakened and fragmented. By the early 22nd century BCE, the unity forged by Sargon and Naram-Sin was giving way to regional independence. Cities such as Uar and Lagash began reasserting autonomy, and new powers were emerging along the frontiers. Among these were the Akkadians, a tribal confederation from the Zagros Mountains, whose incursions into Mesopotamia would soon accelerate Akkad's downfall. The Great Revolts thus marked the beginning of the end, not as a single moment of collapse, but as a protracted erosion of imperial cohesion. They reveal how even the world's first empire, built on innovation and discipline, could falter under the combined weight of human ambition and environmental constraint. As Akkad entered its twilight, Naram-Sin's successors would struggle to preserve what remained of his legacy. Yet the age of divine kingship and centralized empire was fading. The next phase of Mesopotamian history would be defined by fragmentation, adaptation, and the long shadow of Akkad's memory. In the aftermath of Naram-Sin's long reign, the Akkadian Empire entered a period of rapid decline. His successor, Shar-Kali-Sheri, circa 2193 to 2179 BCE, inherited a realm weakened by decades of rebellion, drought, and diminishing resources. The centralized apparatus that had once projected Akkadian authority from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean now struggled simply to maintain order. In this fragile environment, a new threat emerged from the northeastern highlands, the Akkadians, a tribal confederation inhabiting the Zagros Mountains. To contemporary Mesopotamians, the Akkadians represented chaos and disruption, the archetype of the uncivilized outsider. Akkadian and later Sumerian texts describe them as a nomadic people who knew not the proper rights of the gods and who did not know the value of grain. Such portrayals reflect the cultural lens of settled agricultural societies viewing pastoral or semi-nomadic groups as alien and destructive. Yet modern scholarship treats these accounts cautiously. The Akkadians were not a single, unified people, but likely a collection of small tribes who migrated seasonally along the Zagros foothills, trading, raiding, and occasionally settling in the fertile lowlands. The precise nature of their incursions remains debated. Some historians propose that the Akkadian presence in Mesopotamia was gradual, beginning as raids against weakened border towns and evolving into deeper penetration of Akkadian territory. Others argue for a more sudden, large-scale invasion exploiting the political fragmentation following Naram-Sin's death. In either case, the outcome was the same. By the early 22nd century BCE, Akkadian groups had entered the Mesopotamian heartland and disrupted its fragile networks of administration and trade. Shar-Kali-Shari's inscriptions describe repeated conflicts with the Akkadians. The Akkadian army, once the disciplined instrument of Sargon and Naram-Sin's conquests, now fought defensively on multiple fronts. Simultaneous internal revolts, resource scarcity, and the breakdown of communication among provinces compounded the crisis. Records from this period, particularly the later Sumerian king list, suggest that Shar-Kali-Shari's reign ended amid turmoil. Following his death, the empire descended into a period of anarchy, with rival claimants to the throne and the effective dissolution of centralized rule. Archaeological data supports this narrative of collapse. Many northern and central Mesopotamian sites show evidence of abandonment or drastic population decline around this time. In the city of Tel Leilon, excavations reveal layers of wind-blown dust, clear signs of desertification, overlying Akkadian administrative buildings. Similarly, settlement contraction in the Diyala and Upper Tigris regions suggests that the empire's economic core was shrinking. This pattern aligns with the broader 4.2 kiloyear aridification event, a period of severe and prolonged drought that affected much of the Near East, including the Levant and the Iranian plateau. The combination of environmental collapse and political disintegration proved fatal to Akkadian unity. As food production declined and irrigation systems fell into disrepair, the empire's logistical foundation, the redistribution of grain and resources through royal storehouses, ceased to function. Local governors and city assemblies, left without imperial oversight, turned to self-governance. In this vacuum, Akkadian chieftains established control over key urban centers, effectively supplanting the Akkadian administration. Later Mesopotamian texts describe the Akkadian period as one of darkness and disorder. The Sumerian king list laments, "No king was famous. They ruled who had no kingship." To Sumerian scribes writing centuries later, the Akkadian interregnum symbolized the breakdown of civilization itself, a time when temples fell into neglect, trade routes closed, and famine stalked the land. Although these descriptions are exaggerated for rhetorical effect, they preserve a kernel of truth. The centralized bureaucratic state that had defined the Akkadian Empire no longer existed. Yet the Akkadian dominance was neither absolute nor enduring. Their control appears to have been limited primarily to the northern and central plains, with southern city-states like Uruk, Uar, and Lagash maintaining degrees of autonomy. Over time, the Akkadians adopted aspects of Mesopotamian governance, establishing rulers who bore Sumerianized names and issuing administrative documents in cuneiform. This adaptation suggests that, while disruptive, the Akkadian presence did not obliterate urban life, but rather oversaw a transitional phase between empires. One of the most revealing discoveries from this period comes from the city of Adab, where inscriptions record Akkadian rulers adopting traditional royal titulature. This indicates that they sought legitimacy within the framework of Mesopotamian kingship rather than outside it. However, their inability to sustain agricultural recovery or maintain extensive irrigation likely undermined long-term stability. Without the bureaucratic infrastructure and surplus production of earlier Akkadian administration, the Akkadian regime remained precarious. The eventual collapse of Akkadian power was precipitated by the resurgence of southern Sumerian cities, particularly Uruk under Utu-Hegel and later Uar under Uarnamo. Utu-Hegel's inscriptions, written in emphatic Sumerian, celebrate his victory over the Akkadians who knew not the gods, signaling both military triumph and cultural restoration. This victory, dated to around 2112 BCE, marks the symbolic end of the Akkadian period and the beginning of the third dynasty of Uar, Uar III, a new phase of Sumerian revival that consciously invoked the memory of pre-Akkadian traditions while adopting Akkadian administrative innovations. From a broader historical perspective, the Akkadian invasions highlight the cyclical nature of Mesopotamian civilization. The same geographic openness that had enabled trade and communication also exposed the region to external incursions. The fall of Akkad was not merely a military defeat, but a systemic transformation, a rebalancing between highland and lowland cultures, between imperial centralization and local autonomy. In this sense, the Akkadian episode serves as a transitional bridge between the age of empire and the era of renewed Sumerian statehood. One key insight of this period is that collapse did not erase civilization, but reconfigured it. While the Akkadian capital may have been abandoned, the administrative language, record-keeping systems, and imperial ideology it created endured. The subsequent UR3 dynasty would adopt Akkadian as the lingua franca of administration and reinstate centralized bureaucracy, demonstrating the lasting institutional imprint of Akkad even amid its political demise. By the end of the 22nd century BCE, the Akkadians had retreated to the Zagros foothills, leaving behind a Mesopotamia scarred yet resilient. Out of the ruins of the Akkadian Empire would rise a new order, one that combined Sumerian cultural revival with Akkadian statecraft. The lessons of Akkad's rise and fall were not forgotten. They became the foundation for the next great experiment in governance, economy, and religious integration. The collapse of Akkad thus concludes not with disappearance, but with transformation. As the dust settled over abandoned palaces and dried canals, the stage was set for the rebirth of southern Mesopotamia under the kings of Ur. The narrative of civilization, far from ending, would now turn toward renewal, the reconstruction of unity from the fragments of the world's first empire. When the Akkadians finally retreated from the Mesopotamian plains, they left behind a fractured landscape. The once powerful Akkadian Empire was gone, its administrative core dismantled, its cities weakened by decades of neglect. Yet from this political vacuum emerged a remarkable revival, one of the most organized and sophisticated states in early human history, the third dynasty of UR3. This Sumerian resurgence, centered in southern Mesopotamia, would rebuild the region's institutions, codify its legal traditions, and preserve the very memory of Akkad in durable form. The origins of this revival can be traced to Utu-Hegel of Uruk, who around 2120 BC rallied southern cities to expel the Akkadians. His inscriptions, written in classical Sumerian, proclaim victory as a divine act, the restoration of order by the gods after years of chaos. However, Utu-Hegel's reign was brief. Power soon passed to Ur-Nimmu, a governor or military official under Utu-Hegel, who established a new dynasty based in the city of Ur. His ascension around 2112 BC marks the formal beginning of the UR3 period, often described by historians as the Sumerian Renaissance. Ur-Nimmu's achievement lay in his ability to rebuild political unity without the imperial overreach that had doomed Akkad. Instead of conquest through force, he pursued consolidation through administration. His reign reintroduced the Sumerian language as the medium of royal inscription, yet his bureaucracy continued to employ Akkadian cuneiform, demonstrating both continuity and adaptation. In effect, Ur-Nimmu combined the cultural identity of Sumer with the institutional innovations of Akkad. Archaeological evidence from Ur and its surrounding cities reveals extensive public works under his rule. Massive ziggurats, temple towers dedicated to the chief deities of each city, were constructed or restored, symbolizing the renewed bond between heaven and earth. The ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, stands as one of the best preserved examples of Mesopotamian monumental architecture. Its construction required vast amounts of labor and coordination, reflecting not only religious devotion, but also the re-establishment of centralized planning. Equally significant was Ur-Nimmu's effort to standardize governance. He introduced administrative districts, each overseen by appointed officials responsible for taxation, land management, and labor organization. The state maintained detailed records on clay tablets, documenting everything from livestock inventories to the distribution of barley rations. These archives, discovered in sites such as Dagon and Umma, reveal a remarkably sophisticated bureaucracy that managed economic life down to the smallest transaction. One of the most enduring legacies of Ur-Nimmu's reign is his law code, among the earliest known in human history. Predating the more famous Code of Hammurabi by nearly 3 centuries, the Code of Ur-Nammu established legal standards for property, marriage, and compensation for injury. Unlike later codes emphasizing retribution, Ur-Nammu's laws focused on fines and restitution, an early form of codified civil law. The surviving tablets, though fragmentary, include provisions such as, if a man commits murder, that man must be killed, and if a man knocks out the eye of another, he shall weigh out half a mina of silver. These demonstrate an evolving concept of justice, one rooted in the idea of measurable reparation rather than arbitrary punishment. This legal codification represents an insight in Mesopotamian history. For the first time, governance and morality were formalized in writing as universal principles, rather than left to local custom or divine decree. By reducing disputes to written law, Ur-Nammu transformed justice into an administrative function, an innovation that would echo throughout the ancient world. Economically, the Ur-3 state revived Mesopotamia's productivity through an organized redistributive system. Agricultural output, particularly of barley and dates, was carefully monitored. Workers were compensated through rations, a controlled flow of resources that tied the population directly to state authority. This system, sometimes described as temple socialism, blended economic efficiency with religious legitimacy, since temple estates and royal institutions operated jointly as both employers and spiritual centers. Diplomatically, Ur-Nammu sought to stabilize relations with neighboring regions rather than pursue aggressive expansion. Trade routes with Elam, the Zagros foothills, and the Persian Gulf were re-established, bringing copper, timber, and luxury goods into Sumerian cities. Seals and tablets from this period attest to renewed contact with Dilmun, modern Bahrain, and Magan, Oman, suggesting that Mesopotamian commerce had once again become maritime. Despite the prosperity, Ur-Nammu's reign was not without challenge. He died in battle, the circumstances unclear, though likely during a northern campaign to secure border regions once held by Akkad. His death, recorded in later hymns, was lamented as the loss of a just and righteous king. Yet his system endured under his son Shulgi, who would elevate the Ur-3 state to its zenith. Ur-Nammu's unification of Sumer marks one of history's early examples of deliberate cultural restoration. Unlike Sargon's empire, built on conquest and integration, Ur-Nammu's was founded on reconstruction and reform. His policies revived urban life, restored temples, codified law, and rebuilt administrative integrity after a century of fragmentation. In doing so, he redefined kingship as service to both the gods and the people, a synthesis of divine mandate and bureaucratic pragmatism. Archaeologists today view the Ur-3 period as a bridge between the old and new worlds of Mesopotamia, between the mythic age of divine kings and the rational age of organized government. The tablets left behind, numbering in the tens of thousands, provide unparalleled insight into the daily workings of early statehood, from accounting and taxation to education and ritual. In contrast to the ruins of Akkad, the archives of Ur speak of order, renewal, and meticulous control. By the end of Ur-Nammu's reign, southern Mesopotamia had once again become a unified and prosperous region. The cities flourished, canals were restored, and trade flowed freely. Where the Akkadian Empire had overextended, Ur's administration found balance. The revival of Sumer under Ur-Nammu thus stands as one of history's earliest lessons in political recovery, how a civilization can rebuild itself by blending the wisdom of the past with the pragmatism of the present. This renewed foundation would soon be tested, however. As the next king, Shulgi, ascended the throne, he inherited not only stability but the challenge of sustaining it. His reign would transform Ur-3 from a regional power into a truly imperial state, a final flowering of Sumerian civilization before the dawn of new empires to come. When Shulgi, son of Ur-Nammu, ascended the throne around 2094 BCE, he inherited a kingdom stabilized by reform and reconstruction. Over the next half-century, Shulgi would transform this foundation into one of the most advanced administrative and cultural systems in early history. His reign, lasting an extraordinary 48 years, marked the zenith of the UR3 state, a period of disciplined governance, economic precision, and cultural sophistication unmatched in the ancient Near East until centuries later. Shulgi's first priority was consolidation. He reorganized the empire into a tightly managed bureaucratic network, expanding upon his father's administrative model. Every province, or NC-ship, was supervised by a governor who reported directly to the royal palace at Ur. Beneath these officials operated layers of scribes, accountants, and inspectors who maintained meticulous records of agricultural output, labor obligations, and trade. The surviving archives, tens of thousands of clay tablets discovered at Dagon, modern Drayam, Umma, and Ur, demonstrate an unprecedented level of bureaucratic precision. These documents record not only royal decrees but the daily distribution of rations to workers, soldiers, and even temple musicians. Such efficiency required a standardized system of weights, measures, and documentation. Shulgi introduced unified accounting practices, ensuring that grain, livestock, and silver were recorded in comparable units. This standardization created what some historians describe as the first state-controlled economy, where the flow of goods and labor was tracked across the empire in a centralized ledger of clay. The bureaucracy functioned with near-mechanical reliability, a testament to both administrative foresight and the training of professional scribes. To maintain loyalty and coordination across vast territories, Shulgi invested in infrastructure. He ordered the construction of a royal road network linking major cities such as Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and Lagash. Along these routes, a system of way stations, known as bidum, provided food, shelter, and fresh animals for royal messengers. This ensured that communication from the capital could reach distant provinces within days rather than weeks. Such organization prefigures later imperial systems like the Persian courier routes of the Achaemenid Empire, more than a millennium later. Shulgi also elevated the cultural and ideological stature of kingship. Continuing the Akkadian tradition of divine rulers, he declared himself a god-king, the living embodiment of divine justice and order. However, unlike Naram-Sin, whose self-deification provoked theological unease, Shulgi embedded his divinity within the moral and administrative structure of society. Hymns composed during his reign praise him not merely as a conqueror, but as a just ruler, a patron of learning, and a champion of literacy. He was celebrated as a skilled runner, musician, and scholar, an idealized human capable of harmonizing divine wisdom with earthly governance. Education and scholarship flourished under his patronage. Shulgi expanded the Aduba, scribal schools, where young men trained in cuneiform writing, mathematics, and law. The curriculum produced a literate bureaucracy capable of maintaining the state's immense record-keeping apparatus. It is from this period that we find some of the earliest literary compositions in Sumerian, hymns, royal praise poems, and didactic texts, many attributed directly to Shulgi himself or written in his honor. The UR3 period thus represents both an administrative and intellectual peak, preserving the final flowering of Sumerian language before its gradual replacement by Akkadian in later centuries. One of the most striking aspects of Shulgi's administration was its integration of economy and religion. Temples functioned as economic units, controlling land, labor, and storage facilities, while remaining under royal oversight. This system blurred the line between sacred and secular governance. The temple estate became the backbone of the redistributive economy, while the king, as divine mediator, guaranteed its order. Such a fusion ensured both ideological stability and practical control. The gods, the state, and the people were all bound through the language of accounting. At its height, the UR3 state extended influence over much of southern Mesopotamia, parts of Elam, and even the peripheries of the Diyala and Tigris valleys. Shulgi's campaigns against mountain tribes and rival city-states were not aimed at conquest for its own sake, but at securing trade routes and protecting agricultural zones. His inscriptions emphasized the restoration of boundaries and the punishment of rebels rather than imperial expansion. The goal was stability through control, not expansion through war, a strategic lesson drawn from the overextension that had destroyed the Akkadian Empire. Archaeological discoveries reinforce the image of a prosperous and well-ordered society. The city of Ur, Shulgi's capital, saw the completion of its monumental ziggurat begun by Ur-Nimmu, surrounded by temples, palaces, and administrative complexes. Excavations reveal evidence of standardized brick sizes and construction methods, reflecting central planning. The distribution of identical seal impressions across distant cities further attests to the uniformity of administrative practice. Even the state's artisans operated under central direction, producing ceramics, textiles, and metalwork according to standardized specifications. Yet, amid this apparent perfection lay the seeds of fragility. The same bureaucratic structure that enabled control also limited flexibility. Every transaction required documentation. Every deviation from protocol risked censure. The system depended on constant surplus production and unbroken communication. Any disruption, environmental, economic, or military, could cascade through the network with destabilizing effects. Later records indicate that by the end of Shulgi's reign, administrative burdens were growing heavy. The number of scribal records increased dramatically, suggesting mounting complexity and perhaps inefficiency. A key insight from Shulgi's era is how administrative sophistication can reach a point of diminishing returns. The UR3 state's precision became both its strength and its vulnerability. In stable years, it maximized productivity. In unstable times, it magnified stress. This paradox, the most organized societies may be the least adaptable, offers one of history's earliest lessons in systemic fragility. Despite these hidden tensions, Shulgi's reign left a profound legacy. He institutionalized the concept of a state governed by written law, managed through standardized administration, and unified by shared ideology. His fusion of Sumerian tradition with Akkadian statecraft created a model emulated by later dynasties across Mesopotamia. Even as his successors struggled to maintain his level of control, the systems he built, of taxation, labor, and literacy, endured long after the UR3 dynasty's fall. By the close of Shulgi's reign around 2047 BCE, the Sumerian world had reached its administrative and cultural apex. The empire's cities gleamed with restored temples, the scribes' tablets recorded the rhythm of an ordered society, and the king's hymns proclaimed divine harmony across the land. Yet history rarely pauses at perfection. Beyond the boundaries of Sumer, new powers were emerging, and the same climatic and economic pressures that had once destroyed Akkad were stirring again. As Shulgi's successors inherited his vast machine of governance, they faced the challenge that haunts every empire: how to preserve complexity without collapsing under its weight. The next stage in the story of Mesopotamia would reveal whether the system Shulgi perfected could withstand the forces of change gathering at its edges. By the close of Shulgi's long reign, the UR3 state appeared, on the surface, to embody perfection, a realm of administrative precision, moral order, and architectural grandeur. Yet beneath that ordered exterior, the structure of the empire was beginning to strain. The same centralized bureaucracy that had sustained prosperity was slowly becoming a liability. In the century following Ur-Nimmu's unification, the empire's internal systems, taxation, labor management, and logistics, had grown vast, rigid, and increasingly detached from the realities of local life. The collapse of this intricate machinery would unfold gradually, revealing how the pursuit of perfect control can produce its own undoing. The bureaucratic network built under Shulgi was unparalleled in the ancient world. Every province contributed grain, livestock, textiles, and silver to the state economy, all meticulously recorded by scribes. Yet the very scale of documentation hints at overreach. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of thousands of administrative tablets from the UR3 period, an archive so vast that it suggests an almost obsessive level of oversight. Every loaf of bread baked for temple workers, every shipment of barley sent to provincial storehouses, every herd of sheep tallied for sacrificial use was carefully noted. Such record-keeping was designed to prevent corruption and ensure fairness, but it also created inefficiency. The state's reliance on paperwork meant that decision-making slowed, and local officials became fearful of acting without higher approval. As the decades passed, The balance between central authority and regional autonomy tilted dangerously toward the former. Provincial governors, NC, were increasingly constrained by royal auditors and inspectors dispatched from UR. While this centralized control ensured loyalty in times of stability, it weakened local initiative. Cities that had once thrived on independent administration became dependent on directives from the capital. The system's success depended on unbroken communication, an ideal rarely achievable across the floodplains and deserts of Mesopotamia. Economic pressures compounded these administrative burdens. The UR3 economy functioned as a redistributive system. Farmers and craftsmen provided goods and labor to temple and palace estates in exchange for rations of food, clothing, and shelter. This arrangement required a steady agricultural surplus. However, by the late 21st century BCE, signs of environmental decline were once again emerging. Archaeological surveys indicate salinization of southern fields due to over-irrigation, a process in which mineral-rich groundwater accumulated in the soil, reducing fertility. Crop yields, especially of barley, began to fall, forcing administrators to tighten quotas. In response, the state increased labor demands, intensifying strain on the population. The result was a growing cycle of dependency and resentment. As local communities struggled to meet state quotas, they faced punitive measures for shortfalls. Many farmers, unable to repay their obligations, fell into debt servitude, binding families to temple estates for generations. Contemporary records contain numerous references to runaway laborers and petitions for relief, early signs of social fatigue within a seemingly perfect order. Another source of instability was the militarization of labor. To sustain its vast building projects, the state employed a corvée system, compulsory labor service owed to the crown. In theory, these labor drafts were limited in duration. In practice, they often became permanent, especially for the poor. The inscriptional record reveals complaints from local administrators about missing workers, deserters, and shortages of skilled personnel. The empire that had prided itself on organization was increasingly struggling to maintain its workforce. While these internal pressures grew, the empire's external boundaries demanded constant vigilance. Nomadic groups, notably the Amorites to the west and various mountain tribes to the east, began encroaching on Mesopotamian territory. Shulgi had kept them at bay through diplomacy and fortifications, but under his successors, these defenses required enormous resources to maintain. The frontier wall known as the Martu Wall, or the Wall of the Land, built to repel Amorite incursions, extended for hundreds of kilometers. Maintaining it consumed labor and materials that might otherwise have supported agriculture and infrastructure. By the reigns of Amar Sin, 2046 to 2038 BCE, and Shu Sin, 2037 to 2029 BCE, cracks in the system had become visible. Administrative documents reveal emergency measures, ration reductions, emergency conscriptions, and increased emphasis on temple taxation. Some regions began hoarding resources rather than remitting them to the central treasury, indicating waning confidence in the state. At the same time, the sheer volume of records from these years suggests an attempt to maintain control through even tighter documentation, a bureaucracy responding to weakness by intensifying its own rigidity. An insight emerges from this pattern. The UR3 collapse was not triggered by invasion alone, but by the internal exhaustion of an over-centralized state. The empire's success in regulating every aspect of life had left it brittle, unable to adapt when circumstances changed. When crop failures and raids disrupted supply chains, the administrative apparatus, once its strength, became its greatest vulnerability. Religious ideology, once the unifying force of UR3 governance, also began to falter. The divine kingship that Shulgi had elevated required the perception of prosperity and divine favor. As famine and unrest spread, this moral contract eroded. Hymns from the late UR3 period shift in tone from celebration to lament, portraying the gods as distant or angry. The king's role as divine guarantor of order became harder to sustain. When misfortune could no longer be explained as temporary, it was interpreted as divine abandonment, a fatal blow to the legitimacy of any Mesopotamian ruler. By the time of Ibbi Sin, 2028 to 2004 BCE, the last king of UR3, the empire was in open retreat. Provinces such as Isin, Larsa, and Eshnunna asserted independence, while Amorite and Elamite incursions intensified. Records from the Royal Archive at UR reveal pleas for grain and reinforcements that went unanswered, suggesting the capital was increasingly isolated. In its final years, the empire that had once prided itself on meticulous control was reduced to improvisation and desperation. Yet, even in decline, the UR3 state left behind a legacy of order and record unparalleled in antiquity. The thousands of tablets surviving from this period, more than from any earlier civilization, provide a window into how a complex society functioned at its peak and how it strained under its own weight. For historians, these archives are not simply remnants of failure, but evidence of a civilization that, in seeking to perfect human organization, revealed both its potential and its limits. As UR3 weakened, external threats that had long hovered at its margins began to move decisively inward. The Amorites, opportunistic and mobile, began establishing footholds in western cities, while the Elamites, organized and militarized, advanced from the east. The balance between order and chaos that had defined Mesopotamia for centuries was shifting once again. The next phase of the narrative will trace this final unraveling, how foreign invasions and internal exhaustion converged to bring about the fall of UR, ending 2,000 years of Sumerian preeminence and paving the way for new powers to emerge. By the early 21st century BCE, the final act of the UR3 empire was underway. Its administrative perfection had turned fragile, its economy overstretched, and its borders increasingly porous. For decades, the kings of UR had maintained a delicate balance between the agricultural heartlands of Sumer and the restless tribal populations of the periphery. But as the power of the central state waned, these boundaries began to dissolve. Nomadic groups to the west, collectively called the Amorites, Martu in Sumerian, no longer respected the frontiers that had once contained them. From the eastern mountains, the Elamites of present-day southwestern Iran pressed forward, driven by their own political ambitions and tempted by the wealth of a fading empire. The Amorites were not a single invading army, but a network of pastoral tribes migrating into the Mesopotamian plain. Their movement was gradual, more infiltration than conquest. They sought water, pastures, and trade opportunities rather than imperial dominance. Yet their presence disrupted agricultural life and eroded the stability on which UR's bureaucracy depended. Archaeological surveys show that many small rural settlements were abandoned during this period, suggesting displacement and declining agricultural output. Contemporary tablets speak of Martu attacks on fields, loss of herds, and the difficulty of maintaining irrigation systems. The empire's defensive infrastructure, including Shulgi's Great Wall of the Land, proved ineffective. In many areas, local officials simply lacked the men or resources to patrol its vast length. At the same time, the Elamites, longtime rivals and occasional allies of Sumer, began asserting themselves with increasing force. Their kingdom, centered in Anshan and Susa, had grown in power through control of highland trade routes. Initially, Elamite rulers had been bound to UR through diplomacy and intermarriage. Tablets from Shulgi's reign even record the exchange of envoys and the recognition of Elamite vassal status. But as UR's internal cohesion crumbled, Elam saw an opportunity to reverse that hierarchy. Inscriptions from later Elamite sources portray their kings as avengers reclaiming lost autonomy. The reign of Ibbi-Sin, 2028 to 2004 BC, marks the desperate final chapter. Despite holding the royal title King of Sumer and Akkad, Ibbi-Sin's control extended little beyond the walls of UR itself. The once unified provinces, Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and Dur, had become independent city-states, each governed by ambitious leaders who now ruled in their own right. One of these, Ishbaera, a former official of UR who took control of Isin, positioned himself as the heir to Sumerian tradition while withholding support from his former overlord. Economic collapse accompanied this political fragmentation. Grain prices in surviving records from Ibbi-Sin's archives rose sharply, in some cases 30-fold, reflecting both scarcity and inflation. In a desperate attempt to sustain his court and feed the urban population, Ibbi-Sin sent envoys to request shipments of barley from Isin and other cities. These pleas were often ignored. The state's once flourishing redistributive system, the mechanism that had sustained temples, soldiers, and workers alike, had ceased to function. Meanwhile, the Amorite incursions turned from nuisance to catastrophe. Their mobility and local alliances allowed them to bypass fortified routes and strike deep into settled regions. In some cases, Amorite leaders were invited as mercenaries to defend towns, only to establish themselves as rulers once the threat passed. This dynamic explains how, within a generation of Ur's fall, several Amorite dynasties emerged, notably at Babylon, Larsa, and Mari, transforming the political map of Mesopotamia. The fatal blow came from the east. Around 2004 BCE, the Elamite king Kindatu of the Shamashki dynasty launched a full-scale invasion of Sumer. Elamite armies, well-organized and accustomed to mountain warfare, swept into the lower Tigris-Euphrates plain. Contemporary records from Ur describe the invaders advancing inexorably, plundering temples and carrying away captives. Ibbi-Sin attempted to mount a defense, but with his provinces lost and his military resources depleted, resistance was brief. Archaeological layers from the site of Ur confirm widespread destruction and burning, consistent with Elamite assault. The Sumerian Lamentations, poetic yet historically grounded texts composed in the aftermath, preserve the emotional record of this catastrophe. The lament for Ur recounts how the city's walls were breached and its temples defiled, portraying the gods as abandoning their shrines before the invaders arrived. Though couched in religious language, these texts offer insight into the scale of devastation and the cultural trauma of Ur's fall. They describe not only physical ruin but the end of an entire world order, a theocratic and bureaucratic system that had defined Sumerian civilization for centuries. After the conquest, the Elamites deported Ibbi-Sin and his court to Elam, where he died in captivity. With his removal, the Ur-3 dynasty ended, closing the last chapter of Sumerian political unity. The Elamites briefly held control over southern Mesopotamia, but lacked the administrative infrastructure to maintain it. Within a few years, they were driven out by local rulers, among them Ishbaera of Isin, who proclaimed himself the legitimate successor to the kings of Ur. Thus began the Isin-Larsa period, a fragmented age in which multiple Amorite dynasties competed for dominance. The fall of Ur was more than the end of a kingdom. It was a civilizational transition. The Sumerian language, once the medium of governance and religion, gradually gave way to Akkadian, which became the lingua franca of law and diplomacy across the Near East. Yet Sumerian did not vanish. It remained the language of scholarship, liturgy, and tradition, preserved by scribes who regarded Ur's past as a golden age of order and divine favor. In this way, the memory of Ur survived its destruction, shaping the identity of the civilizations that followed. The archaeological legacy of this period provides crucial confirmation of textual accounts. Excavations at Ur reveal both a final phase of monumental construction, perhaps an effort by Ibbi-Sin to reaffirm divine favor, and a sharp break in material culture immediately afterward. Ceramics, urban layouts, and burial practices all change abruptly, reflecting the end of centralized control. In contrast, sites in northern Mesopotamia show continuity, suggesting that the collapse was primarily a southern phenomenon, localized but symbolically immense. The aha realization that emerges here is that empires rarely fall solely to foreign invasion. The Elamite conquest was the catalyst, but the deeper causes lay in the systemic exhaustion of the Ur-3 model, an administrative and ideological system that had ceased to adapt. In its failure, it demonstrated both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of early statehood, how record-keeping could preserve civilization, and how over-reliance on it could hasten collapse. The fall of Ur marked the end of Sumerian dominance, but it did not erase Sumer's influence. Its legal codes, urban planning, religious institutions, and bureaucratic templates were inherited, adapted, and refined by later empires, from Isin and Larsa to Babylon and Assyria. The cultural DNA of Mesopotamia remained unmistakably Sumerian. As Ur's ruins fell silent, the torch passed to new powers. The Amorite dynasties that rose in its aftermath would carry forward the administrative and religious traditions of Sumer into a new age, one that transformed the lessons of collapse into the foundations of the Old Babylonian world. The collapse of the Ur-3 Empire around 2004 BCE did not bring an end to civilization in southern Mesopotamia. Instead, it initiated a century of fragmentation and renewal known to historians as the Isin-Larsa period, circa 2017 to 1763 BC. In this transitional age, new rulers sought to restore order in a landscape marked by political disunity and economic recovery. The legacy of Ur, its administrative systems, religious traditions, and conception of kingship remained powerful, guiding the formation of these successor states. Where Ur had fallen, others now rose to reinterpret its legacy. The first to claim Ur's inheritance was Ishbaera, a former governor of Mari who established his rule at Isin, a city northwest of Ur. Originally an official in the service of Ibbi-Sin, Ishbaera had witnessed firsthand the disintegration of the Ur-3 state. His early reign, circa 2017 to 1985 BCE, reflects both continuity and adaptation. He adopted the royal title King of Sumer and Akkad, signaling legitimacy through tradition, yet his authority was rooted in pragmatic control rather than divine absolutism. His administration preserved the bureaucratic techniques of Ur-3, the use of cuneiform documentation, standardized weights and measures, and temple-based economic management, but applied them in a more decentralized fashion. Archaeological finds from Isin show the persistence of Ur-3 cultural forms: ziggurats dedicated to Nana, the moon god of Ur, administrative tablets recording the distribution of grain and textiles, and hymns written in the Sumerian language, still revered as sacred. These continuities suggest that Ishbaera and his successors viewed themselves not as innovators, but as restorers. They sought to convince both gods and people that the cosmic order disrupted by Ur's fall was being re-established. Yet even as Isin claimed succession, the city of Larsa, further south, was rising as a rival. Founded earlier but revitalized under Gungunum, circa 1932 to 1906 BCE, Larsa drew strength from its proximity to trade routes linking the Persian Gulf with the interior. Gungunum's reign marked a turning point. He seized control of Ur itself, symbolically displacing Isin as the true heir of Sumer. His inscriptions boast of restoring temples and renewing offerings to the gods, echoing the rhetoric of Ur's kings. The competition between Isin and Larsa thus became not merely a struggle for territory, but a contest over legitimacy, over who truly embodied the Sumerian order. This rivalry defined southern Mesopotamia for more than a century. Both kingdoms built irrigation networks, revived urban centers, and commissioned temple restorations. Administrative tablets from the period show a gradual recovery of agricultural productivity and trade. Merchants once again transported copper from Oman, timber from the Levant, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Despite political division, the underlying economic and cultural system of Sumer remained resilient. The Isin-Larsa period also illustrates the adaptability of Mesopotamian institutions. Whereas the Ur-3 state had been highly centralized, the new order allowed greater flexibility. City-states maintained their own temples and local councils, and authority often depended on negotiation rather than decree. The scribal class, trained in both Sumerian and Akkadian, ensured continuity of record-keeping and law. Texts from Isin and Larsa continue to use Sumerian for religious and legal formulas, even as Akkadian became the spoken language of administration. This bilingualism reflects a society conscious of its past, yet open to change. An aha realization emerges here. The Isin-Larsa age demonstrates that collapse in Mesopotamian history was rarely absolute. What appeared as destruction in one generation often served as transformation in the next. The fall of Ur had discredited divine kingship as an unchallengeable institution, but it had not destroyed the idea of sacred governance. Isin and Larsa rulers still styled themselves as chosen by the gods, Yet their power now rested more on effective management and local loyalty than universal control. The period also witnessed subtle social shifts. Freed from the rigid corvée system of UR3, laborers gained limited mobility. Contracts from Larsa record wage-based employment, indicating a move toward monetized labor relations. Land ownership became more diversified, with private individuals and temples jointly participating in agriculture. This diversification fostered a modest revival of local economies and a reduction in the social tensions that had contributed to UR's decline. Religiously, the Isin kings promoted a narrative of restoration. Ishbaera claimed to have restored the rights of Nippur, the city sacred to Enlil, chief of the Mesopotamian pantheon. This act had political as well as spiritual significance. Control of Nippur conferred divine legitimacy. Later kings of Larsa followed suit, emphasizing their rebuilding of shrines and renewal of festivals. The restoration of temples thus became a language of power, a way for rulers to demonstrate continuity with UR3's divine order while asserting their own supremacy. Despite these successes, the Isin Larsa system remained inherently fragile. The absence of a single unifying authority meant that competition was perpetual. Wars of attrition between the two cities drained resources and undermined stability. The archives of Larsa record frequent military campaigns, alliances, and betrayals. In this volatile environment, smaller city-states such as Ashnuna and Mari on the Middle Euphrates also rose to prominence, linking the southern plain to northern Mesopotamian networks. The map of the ancient Near East was becoming increasingly interconnected, setting the stage for broader regional politics. By the early 19th century BCE, the balance tipped decisively in favor of Larsa, particularly under the reign of Rim-Sin I, 1822 to 1763 BC. His conquests extended Larsa's control over much of southern Mesopotamia, effectively unifying the region once again, though briefly. Rim-Sin's kingdom revived the grandeur of UR3 in form, but not in scale. It lacked the administrative depth and ideological cohesion of its predecessor. Nevertheless, it represented a significant step toward political consolidation after 2 centuries of flux. Archaeological and textual evidence from this period, including palace archives and temple inventories, shows a society increasingly confident in its recovery. The scribal schools of Isin and Larsa trained generations of administrators who would later serve under Babylonian kings. In these schools, the Sumerian literary corpus was copied, studied, and preserved, ensuring that the intellectual legacy of UR continued to shape Mesopotamian identity. Thus, the Isin Larsa period stands as both an epilogue to Sumer and a prologue to Babylon. It maintained the essential framework of urban civilization while allowing for experimentation and transition. Where UR3 had represented the height of centralized theocracy, Isin and Larsa embodied pragmatic resilience, a model better suited to an era of shifting alliances and evolving trade. The closing decades of Rim-Sin's reign would see the rise of a new power from the north, Babylon, a modest Amorite city poised to transform Mesopotamian history once again. From the lessons of UR's fall and Isin's recovery, Babylonian kings would craft a more enduring model of empire, one that balanced tradition with adaptation. The next section will explore this pivotal transformation, how Babylon, under Hammurabi, absorbed the heritage of Sumer and Akkad to create a new imperial synthesis that defined the political and legal landscape of the ancient Near East for centuries to come. In the centuries following the collapse of UR3, the landscape of Mesopotamia was characterized by political fragmentation, local autonomy, and economic renewal. Within this mosaic of competing city-states, Babylon, once a modest Amorite settlement on the central Euphrates, began an ascent that would redefine the political and cultural map of the ancient Near East. From roughly 1894 BCE, when the Amorite chieftain Simuabum established the city's independence, to the reign of Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, Babylon evolved from a provincial town into the nucleus of a new imperial tradition, one that drew heavily upon the administrative, religious, and cultural legacy of Sumer and Akkad, yet reshaped it for a new era. Babylon's early rulers, members of an Amorite dynasty, inherited a world still shaped by the memory of Ur and the rivalries of the Ice and Larsa period. The city's geographic position was advantageous. Situated between the northern Akkadian-speaking regions and the southern Sumerian cultural heartland, it was ideally placed to bridge linguistic, economic, and political divides. This centrality allowed Babylon to become a conduit of continuity, a place where older Sumerian traditions could merge with the newer Semitic influences spreading across the Near East. Under Sumuabum's successors, notably Sumalel, circa 1880 to 1845 BCE, and Sabium, circa 1844 to 1831 BCE, Babylon fortified its city walls, established temples, and began asserting authority over neighboring settlements. Archaeological remains from this phase show gradual urban expansion, with temple foundations dedicated to Marduk, a previously minor deity who would soon ascend to national prominence. The elevation of Marduk was more than theological innovation. It reflected a conscious political project to unify the city's diverse population under a shared divine patron. Just as Enlil had once symbolized Sumerian unity and Nergal had defined the martial spirit of Akkad, Marduk would become the emblem of Babylonian sovereignty. By the time of Simubalit, circa 1812 to 1793 BCE, Babylon had emerged as a formidable regional power. The city's rulers engaged in both diplomacy and warfare with their southern rivals, particularly Larsa under Rim-Sinai, and northern neighbors such as Ashnuna and Mari. Trade flourished along the Euphrates and Tigris corridors, connecting Babylon with the resource-rich north and the agricultural south. Contemporary documents reveal a sophisticated economic infrastructure, merchants operating through credit contracts, standardized silver weights, and state oversight reminiscent of the UR3 bureaucracy, but more flexible in application. The lessons of earlier centralization had been absorbed. Babylonian administration emphasized coordination rather than control. The defining moment in Babylon's rise came with the accession of Hammurabi, 1792 to 1750 BCE. His reign marked the culmination of 2 centuries of gradual consolidation. Hammurabi inherited a secure but modest kingdom and, through a combination of military strategy, legal innovation, and ideological vision, transformed it into an empire rivaling those of Sargon and Shulgi. His conquests were both opportunistic and systematic. As Larsa weakened after decades of warfare, Hammurabi moved south, capturing the city and ending Rim-Sin's long rule around 1763 BC. In the north, he neutralized the powers of Ashnuna and Mari, bringing the entire Mesopotamian plain under Babylonian control. Yet Hammurabi's legacy was not merely territorial. His true achievement lay in institutional synthesis. He unified the diverse regions of Mesopotamia by codifying their legal traditions into a single framework, the Code of Hammurabi. Carved on a basalt stele over 2 meters high, the code was less a new invention than a consolidation of existing laws, a reflection of Mesopotamia's long tradition of legalism, stretching back to Ur-Nimmu and Lipitishtar of Isin. Its preface invokes Marduk as the divine source of justice and Hammurabi as his earthly executor, thereby sanctifying political authority through law rather than sheer force. The code's emphasis on fairness, social hierarchy, and property rights provided an enduring model for governance across the Near East. An aha realization emerges here. Hammurabi's empire succeeded precisely because it reinterpreted the Sumerian idea of divine kingship in rational and institutional terms. Where UR3 had relied on a sacred bureaucracy and ritual authority, Babylon built legitimacy on codified justice and administrative pragmatism. In doing so, it ensured continuity without rigidity, an adaptive evolution rather than an ideological revival. Culturally, Hammurabi's reign marked the final integration of Sumerian and Akkadian traditions. The Sumerian language, no longer spoken in daily life, survived as a medium of scholarly and religious learning. Temple archives continued to preserve Sumerian hymns, myths, and lexical lists, now systematically translated into Akkadian for instruction. This dual linguistic heritage formed the foundation of Mesopotamian education for the next millennium. The scribal schools of Babylon became centers of intellectual preservation, ensuring that the literature of Ur, Lagash, and Nippur remained accessible to future generations. Religiously, Babylon achieved what neither Akkad nor Ur had accomplished, a centralized pantheon centered on Marduk. The Enuma Elish, composed in later centuries but rooted in this period, mythologized Marduk's rise by portraying him as the god who brings cosmic order from chaos. This theological transformation mirrored political reality, the consolidation of fragmented city-states under a single ruler. Through religion, Babylon projected its vision of harmony and authority across Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence from Babylon during Hammurabi's reign reveals extensive urban development, new canals, temple restorations, and monumental gates. These projects served not only economic purposes, but also ideological ones. They visualized the renewal of order, linking Hammurabi's works to the great kings of the past. Inscriptions frequently reference his building efforts in language echoing Ur-Nemmu's earlier proclamations. This conscious revival of Sumerian precedent under Amorite rule exemplifies the enduring continuity of Mesopotamian political culture. By the end of Hammurabi's reign, Babylon had become the uncontested metropolis of Mesopotamia, a hub of law, learning, and commerce. Yet, as with the empires before it, its strength carried within it the seeds of overextension. After Hammurabi's death, his successors struggled to maintain control over the far-flung territories he had conquered. Within a century, new powers, particularly the Kassites from the Zagros Mountains, would overrun the city, marking another shift in Mesopotamia's long historical rhythm of rise and renewal. Nevertheless, the old Babylonian Empire established enduring norms. Its legal and administrative principles influenced not only later Mesopotamian dynasties, but also neighboring civilizations, including the Hittites and Assyrians. More profoundly, it preserved and transmitted the cumulative legacy of Sumer and Akkad, the belief that order, law, and divine mandate were inseparable foundations of civilization. Thus, the rise of Babylon did not erase the Sumerian past, it fulfilled it in a new idiom. The cultural and institutional memory of Ur lived on, reframed through Marduk's theology, Hammurabi's justice, and the pragmatic governance of the Amorite kings. Through Babylon, the ancient heritage of the southern plains achieved permanence, bridging the world of the early city-states and the coming empires of the first millennium BCE. In the next section, we turn from imperial ascent to intellectual legacy, examining how the scribal culture, religious cosmology, and legal traditions of Sumer and Akkad were preserved, systematized, and transmitted during and after the Babylonian Age, ensuring that the achievements of early Mesopotamia would resonate for millennia. While political fortunes in Mesopotamia shifted from Sumer to Akkad, and from Ur to Babylon, one institution remained remarkably constant: the scribal school, the intellectual heart of ancient civilization. After the fall of Ur-3, when cities were rebuilt and dynasties reformed, it was the scribes who preserved the connective tissue of Mesopotamian culture. Their clay tablets carried not only economic accounts and legal decrees, but also the accumulated memory of 2 millennia, the languages, myths, rituals, and laws that defined civilization itself. The continuity of scribal education after the collapse of Ur-3 represents one of history's most profound examples of cultural resilience. In the cities of Isin, Larsa, and especially Babylon, scribal academies known as Adaba, literally tablet houses, served as the central institutions for training new generations of administrators and scholars. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Nippur, Ur, and Sippar have yielded thousands of school tablets, many inscribed with student exercises, lists of signs, grammatical drills, mathematical problems, and literary compositions. These exercises reveal a structured curriculum that linked the emerging Babylonian world to its Sumerian predecessors. In these Adaba, students learned first to shape clay and inscribe cuneiform symbols, mastering hundreds of signs through repetition. They copied ancient lexical lists, systematic vocabularies that paired Sumerian words with their Akkadian equivalents, preserving linguistic knowledge long after Sumerian had ceased to be a spoken language. This practice gave rise to the bilingual scholarly tradition that would dominate Mesopotamian learning for the next 1500 years. By maintaining Sumerian as a learned language, scribes anchored their education in the deep past, treating it as a repository of sacred and intellectual authority. The content of scribal instruction extended far beyond administration. Students memorized and reproduced Sumerian literature, including hymns to the gods, royal inscriptions, and epic narratives. Among these were the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Lament for Uar, and hymns to Inanna and Enlil, texts first composed during the late 3rd millennium BCE. By the Old Babylonian period, these works were being recopied with commentary, indicating that they were already regarded as canonical. The act of preservation was deliberate. It represented a cultural self-awareness that sought to preserve memory through formal transmission. Mathematics and science also flourished within this scribal framework. The scribes of Babylon inherited the sexagesimal, base, 60, numerical system of the Sumerians and refined it into a practical tool for measurement, trade, and astronomy. Surviving tablets from this period contain advanced calculations, including quadratic equations and geometric progressions, demonstrating a level of abstraction far beyond simple accounting. This mathematical continuity underscores an important insight. The intellectual legacy of Sumer did not depend on empire, but on education. Even when kings fell and dynasties changed, the system of learning provided the means for civilization to regenerate itself. The organization of knowledge during this period reflected both conservatism and innovation. Scribes were trained to revere ancient texts as models of wisdom, yet they also engaged in adaptation, updating administrative formats, introducing new terminology, and integrating foreign influences. For instance, as Amorite and Akkadian dialects became dominant, scribes devised new grammatical conventions to accommodate linguistic change while maintaining conceptual consistency. This synthesis allowed Babylonian scholars to function as mediators between past and present, ensuring that Sumerian heritage remained intelligible and usable. An aha realization emerges here. In Mesopotamia, the true continuity of civilization was not political but textual. Dynasties rose and fell, but the written word created a stable thread through time. The clay tablet, durable and abundant, became the archive of collective memory. Through it, scribes preserved not only administrative records, but also the intellectual DNA of Mesopotamia, its cosmology, mathematics, and moral order. Religion and scholarship were deeply intertwined in this process. The temples of major deities such as Enlil in Nippur, Nana in Uar, and Marduk in Babylon functioned as both spiritual centers and repositories of knowledge. Priests served simultaneously as astronomers, physicians, and chroniclers. Temple archives contained astronomical observations used for calendrical purposes, omen texts that linked celestial events to earthly affairs, and ritual prescriptions guiding daily worship. This merging of empirical and theological knowledge reflected the Mesopotamian worldview, that order in heaven and order on earth were mirror images sustained by accurate record and correct ritual. By the Old Babylonian period, a new synthesis of religious and intellectual authority had emerged. The figure of the learned scribe, Umanu, became both historian and philosopher, preserving the wisdom of antiquity while interpreting it for contemporary rulers. Royal courts relied on these scholars not only for record-keeping, but for legitimation. Kings commissioned literary works that linked their reigns to Sumerian predecessors, drawing on the authority of Uarnemu, Shulgi, and Sargon. In doing so, they transformed cultural memory into political capital. Archaeological discoveries from Nippur and Sippar reveal the impressive scale of these scholarly archives. In Nippur, thousands of tablets were found stacked systematically in what appears to have been a state-sponsored library. Many bear signs of organized cataloging, suggesting an early form of archival science. In Sippar, temple records preserve lists of omens and astronomical data that would later form the basis for Mesopotamian astrology. Together, these collections attest to a civilization that understood knowledge as an instrument of governance and continuity. The persistence of the scribal tradition ensured that the Sumerian worldview, with its emphasis on cosmic balance, divine order, and human stewardship, endured long after the fall of Sumer itself. Concepts such as me, divine ordinances, namtar, destiny, and kingship from heaven survived in Akkadian translation, influencing the theological vocabulary of later Near Eastern cultures. Through language and learning, Sumerian metaphysics continued to shape thought from Babylon to Assyria and beyond. This transmission was not static. As scribes copied and reinterpreted ancient texts, they also introduced commentary, glosses, and revisions. Over generations, this process of cumulative annotation transformed the Sumerian corpus into a living canon, one that evolved even as it preserved. The Enuma Elish, though composed centuries after Sumer's decline, still bears traces of Sumerian cosmology, the creation from chaos, the divine ordering of the world, and the sanctification of kingship. By the late Old Babylonian period, the scribal identity had become a symbol of civilization itself. To be literate in cuneiform was to belong to an intellectual lineage stretching back to the first temple archives of Uruk. In this sense, every Babylonian scholar was a custodian of Sumer, the last descendant of an unbroken chain of learning that defined the world's first literate society. Thus, the preservation of knowledge after the fall of Ur was not merely an act of remembrance, it was an act of rebirth. Through schools, libraries, and temples, the memory of Sumer became the foundation of Mesopotamian identity. The fall of empires did not erase its wisdom, it refined it. The clay tablets of scribes became the silent continuity between civilizations, a bridge that carried the ideas of Sumer into the intellectual and religious systems of later ages. In the following chapter, the narrative turns to examine this long legacy beyond Mesopotamia, tracing how the intellectual, legal, and cosmological traditions of Sumer and Akkad influenced neighboring civilizations from the Hittites to the Hebrews, ensuring that the world's first great civilization continued to shape human thought long after its cities had turned to dust. The collapse of the Akkadian and Ur dynasties did not signal the disappearance of Mesopotamian civilization. Instead, it marked the beginning of its diffusion, the gradual transmission of its language, institutions, and cosmological ideas far beyond the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates. Over the following centuries, as trade routes expanded and empires rose across the Near East, the intellectual DNA of Sumer and Akkad quietly permeated the political and religious systems of neighboring peoples. Archaeological and textual evidence reveal that from the early 2nd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian influence spread through a complex web of commerce, diplomacy, and migration. Caravans from Babylon and Mari traveled northward to Anatolia and westward to Syria and the Levant, carrying not only goods, textiles, tin, and lapis lazuli, but also scribes, administrators, and religious emissaries. The exchange of commodities was inseparable from the exchange of ideas. Cuneiform, once a local invention, became the lingua franca of diplomacy across the ancient Near East. This diffusion is most clearly seen in the Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablets discovered in Egypt and dating to the 14th century BCE. Written in Akkadian, centuries after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, they record correspondence between the pharaohs and foreign rulers from cities such as Ugarit, Byblos, Alashia, Cyprus, and Hutti. The choice of Akkadian as a diplomatic language demonstrates the enduring prestige of Mesopotamian literacy and bureaucracy. Even distant courts recognized it as the medium of formal record, law, and communication. The process of transmission was not limited to language. Mesopotamian concepts of kingship, law, and cosmic order spread alongside cuneiform literacy. The notion that royal authority derived from divine mandate, a theme articulated in Sumerian inscriptions and perfected under Sargon and Naram-Sin, became foundational to later Near Eastern polities. In Hittite and Assyrian ideology, kings were portrayed as mediators between gods and humanity, responsible for maintaining Misarum, justice, and equilibrium, an echo of the Sumerian concept of me, the divine ordinances that structured the world. Similarly, Mesopotamian legal traditions exerted lasting influence. The Code of Hammurabi, circa 1750 BCE, though written in Babylon, drew heavily on earlier Sumerian legal precedents, particularly those from the city of Ur. The principles it articulated, standardized penalties, proportional justice, and protection of property, became templates for later law codes across the region. Archaeologists have uncovered similar legal formulations in Hittite, Assyrian, and Hebrew contexts, suggesting a shared intellectual inheritance rooted in Sumerian jurisprudence. Religious and cosmological ideas also traversed borders. The pantheon of Mesopotamia, centered on deities such as Enlil, Inanna, and Shamash, inspired local adaptations across the Near East. In Syria, the storm god Baal acquired traits reminiscent of Enlil's authority. In Canaan, the goddess Astarte bore the attributes of Inanna Ishtar. This process of syncretism demonstrates not simple borrowing, but conceptual translation, the re-expression of Mesopotamian cosmology in local symbolic systems. The result was a shared cultural vocabulary of divinity, kingship, and moral order spanning the Fertile Crescent. A particularly striking example of this continuity appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which circulated widely in translated or adapted forms. Fragments of the epic have been found as far afield as Hattusa and Megiddo, attesting to its popularity among scribal circles beyond Mesopotamia. The story's exploration of mortality, wisdom, and divine limits resonated across cultures. Its flood narrative, likely derived from earlier Sumerian traditions, parallels the later biblical account of Noah, a testament to the enduring power of Mesopotamian myth to shape regional thought. Trade further amplified these connections. Merchant colonies such as Kultepe, ancient Kanesh, in Anatolia maintained extensive correspondence with Mesopotamian cities, using Akkadian tablets to record transactions and contracts. Through these networks, Mesopotamian accounting methods, measurement systems, and contractual formulas became standard practice in commercial hubs across the Near East. The spread of standardized weights, seal iconography, and cylinder seals with Akkadian motifs illustrates how deeply the administrative technologies of Sumer and Akkad penetrated foreign economies. The Hittite Empire provides one of the clearest cases of cultural adaptation. While the Hittite language was Indo-European, its writing system, bureaucratic procedures, and even certain ritual forms were inherited directly from Mesopotamia. The Hittite archives of Hattusa include thousands of cuneiform tablets modeled after Babylonian prototypes, many containing Mesopotamian myths translated into Hittite. The use of Akkadian loanwords in Hittite religious vocabulary underscores the prestige of Mesopotamian learning, even among culturally distinct peoples. In the Levant, Ugarit became a focal point of cultural hybridization. Though the city developed its own alphabetic script, its scribes were trained in Mesopotamian methods, and its literature displays thematic parallels with Sumerian and Akkadian epics. The Ugaritic Baal cycle reflects structural and theological motifs derived from Mesopotamian cosmology, the conflict between order and chaos, the divine assembly, and the cyclical renewal of kingship. Through Ugarit, these ideas would later enter the cultural matrix that informed Israelite religion and early biblical thought. One of the most revealing insights from this period is that Mesopotamian civilization became a model rather than an empire. Its intellectual influence endured precisely because it no longer relied on political domination. Unlike the transient authority of kings, written culture could transcend frontiers and centuries. The Akkadian language, preserved in its cuneiform script, functioned as a vehicle of memory, a unifying medium through which different societies could access and reinterpret the wisdom of Sumer. Even Egypt, long resistant to foreign influence, absorbed Mesopotamian ideas through contact during the Middle and New Kingdoms. Administrative reforms, calendrical systems, and elements of astronomical observation reveal indirect borrowings from Babylonian precedents. The cross-pollination was mutual. Egyptian trade goods and artistic motifs, in turn, circulated through Mesopotamian markets. The Near East in this period formed a connected intellectual ecology, with Mesopotamia as its original center of gravity. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, the international age of the Near East had fully emerged, a world of interconnected kingdoms communicating through shared diplomatic and scholarly conventions derived from Sumer and Akkad. The Akkadian tongue remained the medium of state correspondence until gradually replaced by Aramaic in the first millennium BCE. Yet, even then, its imprint endured in the structure of Near Eastern bureaucracies and the moral philosophies of later empires. The story of Mesopotamian influence thus reveals an important principle. Cultural power can outlast political power. The institutions of writing, law, and kingship first devised in Sumer became foundational templates for civilization itself. From Anatolia to Egypt, from the Levant to Persia, traces of these ideas shaped how societies understood authority, morality, and the cosmos. In the next section, the documentary turns from the spread of Mesopotamian ideas to their transformation in the first millennium BCE, when Assyria and Babylon revived and reinterpreted the legacy of Sumer and Akkad, consciously positioning themselves as heirs to the world's first empire, even as the ancient languages began to fade from use. By the dawn of the first millennium BCE, Mesopotamia had witnessed cycles of collapse and renewal for more than 2,000 years. Yet the memory of its earliest empires, Sumer and Akkad, remained alive in texts, rituals, and royal ideology. When new powers arose in the north and south, the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, they did not regard themselves as inventors of civilization, but as restorers of an ancient order. Their kings ruled not as innovators, but as inheritors, consciously reviving the administrative and theological principles first articulated under Sargon and Naram-Sin. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, c. 900 to 612 BCE, emerged from the city of Assur, situated on the Middle Tigris. Although Assyria had existed as a regional power since the second millennium BCE, it was during the reigns of Ashurnasirpal II, Tiglath-Pileser III, and Sargon II that it transformed into a centralized, militarized state, the largest and most efficiently governed empire the Near East had yet seen. The very title, King of the Four Quarters of the World, used by Assyrian monarchs, was a direct invocation of Sargon of Akkad's epithet. This deliberate archaism reflects how the Assyrian kings constructed legitimacy, through continuity with the first great unifier of Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence from Assyrian capitals such as Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Nineveh shows that royal inscriptions were composed in a revived Akkadian dialect, though now stylized and formalized. The scribes of Assyria were heirs to the same scribal tradition that had preserved Sumerian texts for centuries. They maintained extensive libraries, recording not only annals and administrative lists, but also copies of ancient Sumerian and Babylonian works. The most famous example, the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, contained over 30,000 tablets, including lexical lists, legal codes, astronomical observations, and literary compositions, among them, the complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The function of these collections extended beyond scholarship. They were ideological instruments, reinforcing the king's identity as guardian of cosmic order and heir to divine wisdom. Ashurbanipal explicitly portrayed himself as a learned monarch, claiming mastery of the obscure tablets from before the flood, a phrase that linked him to the mythical antiquity of Sumerian civilization. Through the curation of texts, the Assyrian state cast itself as the intellectual and spiritual successor of Akkad. The Assyrian model of governance likewise drew upon ancient precedents. Its provincial system, with governors, or saknu, administering conquered territories, resembled the centralized bureaucracy of the Akkadian Empire. Tribute lists, labor levies, and military conscription followed patterns first formalized under Sargon's rule. Yet the Assyrians adapted these methods to a more complex world, incorporating multi-ethnic populations and diverse economies. The result was an empire that combined brutal efficiency with administrative sophistication, a distant echo of Akkad's organizational genius. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, 626 to 539 BCE, represented the southern counterpart to this revival. Centered on the ancient city of Babylon, it rose following the collapse of Assyrian power and consciously reasserted the cultural supremacy of Sumer's heartland. Its most famous ruler, Nebuchadnezzar II, 604 to 562 BCE, undertook monumental construction projects that transformed Babylon into a symbol of divine kingship. The city ziggurat, The Edamananki, meaning House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, evoked the ancient temple towers of Ur and Eridu. Its structure and name recall the architectural traditions of early Sumer, demonstrating how the builders of the 6th century BCE looked back to the 3rd millennium for inspiration. Under the Neo-Babylonians, Sumerian religious traditions were reinterpreted and consolidated. The god Marduk, long a city deity of Babylon, absorbed the attributes of earlier gods such as Enlil, becoming the supreme deity of the Mesopotamian pantheon. This theological synthesis paralleled earlier patterns of divine hierarchy established under Sargon and Naram-Sin, who had similarly centralized worship to reinforce political authority. The Enuma Elish, a creation epic composed in Babylon, drew upon older Sumerian cosmologies, positioning Marduk as the divine architect who imposes order on chaos, a motif with roots in the earliest temple myths of Eridu. The Neo-Babylonian kings also continued the ancient practice of royal inscription and record-keeping. Cylinder inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar's reign recount his building works in formulaic Akkadian, following literary conventions established over a millennium earlier. Even the visual iconography, the king receiving a staff and ring from the gods, reproduces the imagery found on Akkadian cylinder seals. This deliberate antiquarianism was not mere nostalgia. It was a statement of legitimacy, anchoring new power in the unbroken lineage of Mesopotamian kingship. Economically, the Neo-Babylonian Empire maintained the administrative rationality of its predecessors. Extensive archives from Babylon, Sippar, and Uruk record taxation, temple revenues, and agricultural management. The persistence of the cuneiform accounting system into the late 6th century BCE, despite the growing use of alphabetic scripts elsewhere, demonstrates the conservative stability of Mesopotamian bureaucracy. Scribes continued to train in both Sumerian and Akkadian texts, maintaining bilingual literacy long after Sumerian had vanished from speech. One aha moment of this era lies in recognizing that the Assyrian and Babylonian revivals were acts of deliberate historical consciousness. These empires did not merely inherit Sumerian and Akkadian traditions by chance, they curated them. Their kings collected, copied, and canonized ancient texts as a means of constructing imperial identity. In doing so, they transformed the past into a tool of governance, an early form of cultural historiography. Assyria and Babylon became civilizations sustained not only by armies, but by archives. The final centuries of Mesopotamian independence witnessed the last flowering of cuneiform scholarship. Astronomical observations from Babylon during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE exhibit remarkable precision, forming the basis for later Hellenistic and Persian scientific traditions. The Babylonian mathematical astronomical model, which linked celestial movements to cyclical patterns of time, would influence Greek astronomy through the works of later scholars such as Hipparchus and Ptolemy. Even after the fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE, Persian administrators retained many elements of the Babylonian system, including calendar reckoning and bureaucratic record-keeping. By this stage, the Sumerian language was long extinct, and Akkadian itself was beginning to fade. Yet the conceptual framework these languages carried, the notions of divine kingship, recorded law, and cosmic order, had been fully integrated into the political culture of the Near East. When Alexander the Great conquered Mesopotamia 2 centuries later, his chroniclers noted that Babylon remained a city of scholars and temples, where priests still traced the lineage of kings back to Sargon. The Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires thus represent the final synthesis of Mesopotamian civilization, the culmination of 3,000 years of continuous development in writing, administration, and theology. They stand as monuments not merely to political ambition, but to historical memory, societies that built their future by curating their past. In the final chapter, the documentary turns to consider how the legacy of Sumer and Akkad survived beyond antiquity itself, through the transmission of knowledge to Greece, Persia, and the modern world, and through the rediscovery of Mesopotamia by archaeology, which restored the world's first civilization to human memory. For more than 2,000 years after the fall of Babylon, the names Sumer and Akkad faded into obscurity. Their cities lay buried beneath layers of silt and time, their scripts unread, their stories reduced to scattered echoes in the writings of later civilizations. To the classical Greeks and Romans, Mesopotamia was little more than the land between the rivers, a region of ancient wonders and distant kings. The great empires of Assyria and Babylon remain known only through biblical references and vague traditions. The older worlds of Sumer and Akkad had vanished almost entirely from human memory. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia in the 19th century stands as one of the defining achievements of modern scholarship, an event that restored to history the earliest chapters of human civilization. This intellectual awakening began with curiosity, advanced through science, and culminated in revelation. Through archaeology, philology, and patient excavation, the silent plains of Iraq revealed a civilization that predated Greece and Egypt in key aspects of urban life, writing, and governance. The story began in the early 1800s, when European explorers and diplomats traveling through the Ottoman provinces of Mesopotamia encountered massive earthen mounds scattered across the landscape. Local legends attributed these ruins to biblical figures such as Nimrod or Nebuchadnezzar, but their true origins were unknown. The first systematic investigations were carried out by Paul-Émile Botta, the French consul at Mosul, and Austin Henry Layard, a British adventurer. Between 1843 and 1851, their excavations at Khorsabad and Nineveh uncovered the palaces of the Assyrian kings, monumental reliefs, colossal winged bulls, and thousands of inscribed clay tablets. At first, these discoveries seemed to confirm only the existence of Assyria, long known from the Bible. But the tablets themselves held a greater secret. They were written in cuneiform, a script that had been undeciphered for over 2 millennia. Scholars soon realized that if this writing could be read, it might unlock the entire history of the ancient Near East. The task of decipherment fell to a generation of linguists, notably Henry Rawlinson, an officer of the British East India Company. In the 1830s, Rawlinson copied and studied the Behistun inscription in western Iran, a trilingual monument of the Persian king Darius I, written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. By comparing the known Persian text with its cuneiform equivalents, he and others succeeded in breaking the code. By the 1850s, cuneiform was readable, and the ancient voices of Mesopotamia began to speak again. What emerged astonished the world. The tablets from Nineveh contain not only royal annals and administrative records, but also myths, hymns, and scientific treatises. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh, a work of literature older than Homer, and accounts of a great flood strikingly similar to the biblical story of Noah. These revelations reshaped the understanding of ancient history, showing that the roots of Western civilization extended deeper and farther east than previously imagined. In the decades that followed, archaeologists expanded their explorations southward into the older lands of Babylonia and Sumer. Excavations at Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur revealed cities far older than Assyria, with inscriptions naming rulers like Ur-Nimmu and Gudea, and languages that were neither Semitic nor Indo-European. Philologists soon identified this ancient tongue as Sumerian, the world's earliest known written language. The rediscovery of Sumer in the late 19th century fundamentally altered the chronology of civilization, shifting its origins from the 2nd to the 4th millennium BCE. The 20th century saw further milestones. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur in the 1920s uncovered royal tombs rich with gold, lapis lazuli, and musical instruments, material proof of a complex urban society flourishing around 2600 BCE. The discovery of cylinder seals, administrative tablets, and standardized weights confirmed that these early Mesopotamians had developed systems of trade, governance, and record-keeping millennia before classical antiquity. Each find added new depth to humanity's understanding of its own beginnings. One aha insight arising from these discoveries is that the modern concept of civilization itself owes much to Mesopotamian archaeology. The word civilization, often associated with cities, writing, and law, found its first complete expression in Sumer. The unearthing of temples, schools, and archives revealed that the essential components of organized society, bureaucracy, religion, and intellectual life had all taken recognizable form along the Tigris and Euphrates. The study of Mesopotamia thus became not just a branch of archaeology, but a mirror through which humanity viewed its origins. The decipherment of Sumerian and Akkadian also transformed the field of comparative linguistics. By revealing a literate, non-Indo-European language in early history, Sumerian challenged long-held assumptions about the progression of human communication. Its combination of pictographic and phonetic signs illuminated the evolution of writing systems across the ancient world, influencing later studies of Egyptian hieroglyphs and Chinese logographs. The systematic nature of cuneiform administration, preserved in thousands of tablets, offered scholars the first comprehensive model of how writing functioned as a tool of governance. By the mid-20th century, the rediscovered world of Sumer and Akkad had become a cornerstone of academic inquiry. Institutions such as the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, the British Museum, and the Louvre established dedicated departments for Assyriology. Excavations continued across Iraq and Syria, revealing the complexity of early Mesopotamian urban networks and their influence on later empires. The publication of the Sumerian king list, the Code of Ur-Nemu, and administrative archives from Ebla and Mari provided scholars with an unbroken chronological framework stretching back 5,000 years. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia also carried profound cultural implications. It reframed the relationship between ancient myth and historical reality, showing that the great stories of Genesis and the Flood had roots in far older traditions. It demonstrated that the intellectual achievements once attributed solely to Greece, mathematics, astronomy, and literature, had antecedents in the scribal schools of Ur and Nippur. In this way, archaeology restored balance to the narrative of human progress, recognizing the peoples of Mesopotamia as the true pioneers of recorded history. Yet perhaps the most striking realization is that, even after millennia of silence, the tablets of Sumer and Akkad continue to shape modern thought. Their rediscovery gave birth to the scientific study of civilization, the comparative method in history, and the recognition that human culture evolves through accumulation rather than replacement. As the 20th century advanced, war and instability in the Middle East sometimes halted excavation, but the legacy of discovery endured. Digital technologies now preserve millions of cuneiform texts in virtual archives, ensuring that the voices of Sumer and Akkad remain accessible to scholars worldwide. Through these efforts, the first civilizations have re-entered the collective human story, no longer as myth, but as the documented origin of history itself. In the concluding section, the documentary reflects on the enduring legacy of Sumer and Akkad, how their rediscovery reshaped our understanding of time, continuity, and the very definition of what it means to be civilized. The rediscovery of the Akkadian and Sumerian worlds did more than restore a forgotten past. It changed the intellectual landscape of the modern era. The recovery of ancient Mesopotamia in the 19th and 20th centuries gave humanity a new temporal horizon, extending written history thousands of years beyond what classical scholars once imagined. The Sumerians and Akkadians, once lost beneath the sands of Iraq, re-emerged as the founders of civilization, the first people to write, to govern through law, and to imagine a cosmos ordered by reason as much as by faith. Through their recovered tablets, modern readers encountered a society both alien and familiar. Its people recorded grain deliveries and royal decrees, but also prayers, songs, and reflections on mortality. They sought order in the heavens, justice on earth, and meaning in the cycles of life. Their myths and laws formed a mirror in which modern humanity could recognize its own intellectual ancestry. For the first time, history could trace not only events but ideas, the birth of reasoning, administration, and moral order. In the early 20th century, as scholars published the first translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the implications rippled far beyond archaeology. Philosophers, historians, and theologians began to reconsider the origins of human thought. Concepts once believed to have arisen with the Greeks or Hebrews were now seen as products of a much earlier age. The Code of Ur-Nemu and the later Code of Hammurabi provided a legal foundation predating the Mosaic tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh anticipated questions of mortality and purpose that would echo throughout later literature. Even the structure of urban governance, from the temple to the palace, revealed the first attempts to reconcile personal ambition with collective stability. These revelations forced a rethinking of cultural descent. Civilization was no longer viewed as a sudden awakening in the Mediterranean, but as a continuum beginning in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. The Sumerians and Akkadians became the first link in a long chain of transmission, one that passed through Babylon and Persia, to Greece and Rome, and finally to the modern world. The tools they forged, writing, mathematics, timekeeping, and codified law, became the permanent architecture of human progress. One of the most striking legacies of Akkadian and Sumerian civilization lies in the invention of time itself. The division of hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees derives directly from the Mesopotamian sexagesimal system. Their astronomers charted the movements of the stars with a precision that enabled the development of calendars and agricultural cycles still recognizable today. When a modern clock marks 60 minutes, it quietly preserves a concept of order first formalized more than 4,000 years ago. Equally enduring is the legacy of language and record-keeping. The cuneiform tablet, though primitive in appearance, represents the first known attempt to externalize memory, to preserve thought independent of speech. In doing so, it transformed human cognition. Knowledge could now be stored, organized, and transmitted across generations. The modern world of archives, libraries, and digital databases owes its conceptual origin to that first impulse to write on clay. Archaeologists and historians also note that the administrative structure of Mesopotamia provided an early model for the bureaucratic state. The temple and palace economies of Akkad relied on standardized measures, rations, and labor accounting. Clay ledgers recorded the distribution of food, silver, and livestock, evidence of a society organized around planned resource management. In these tablets, one can see the embryonic form of the systems that govern nations today: taxation, contracts, and centralized oversight. The Akkadian innovation of imperial administration, extending control over diverse peoples through written law and appointed governors, became a defining feature of all subsequent empires. Yet the legacy of the Akkadians and Sumerians is not merely institutional. It is also philosophical. Their writings reveal a consciousness aware of human fragility amid vast, impersonal forces, nature, fate, and divine will. The laments of Sumerian priests and the reflections of Gilgamesh on mortality represent the first recorded encounters with existential thought. In these texts, historians recognize the birth of human self-awareness, a step that would later mature into philosophy, religion, and science. The 20th century's study of Mesopotamia also reshaped the modern understanding of cultural continuity. As wars and technological upheavals redefined the 20th century, the rediscovery of Sumer and Akkad offered a humbling perspective that human civilization, however advanced, rests on foundations laid by people who first irrigated the soil of the Euphrates. Their world was not primitive but pioneering, an experiment in cooperation, belief, and knowledge that has never truly ended. In the global imagination, the ancient Near East became a symbol of origins. Museums across the world, from London to Baghdad, Paris to Chicago, displayed the tablets, seals, and statues that reconnected modern humanity with its earliest builders of cities and laws. The first clay tablet and the first bronze weapon became relics not of obscurity but of awakening, evidence that progress itself is a cumulative inheritance. Today, as archaeologists digitize thousands of cuneiform texts and as linguists reconstruct the grammar of long-dead tongues, the Akkadian and Sumerian worlds continue to evolve in our collective knowledge. Every new translation refines understanding. Every excavation redraws the map of early civilization. The continuity of inquiry, from Sargon scribes to 21st century databases, exemplifies the enduring human drive to preserve memory and seek understanding. A particularly revealing insight arises from the realization that the fall of Akkad did not erase its ideas. Though its cities were abandoned, its systems endured, absorbed by Babylon, transmitted to Assyria, and later diffused across empires reaching the Mediterranean. In this way, the Akkadian Empire's true legacy was not its territory, but its method, governance by written law, administration through record, and communication across cultures. The empire's collapse was a political event. Its influence became a civilizational constant. The modern world, built upon literacy, bureaucracy, and law, remains conceptually indebted to this first experiment in organized complexity. When governments record decrees, when courts cite precedent, when scholars archive data, they continue practices that began in the offices of Sumerian and Akkadian scribes more than 4,000 years ago. In reflecting on this immense span of continuity, historians recognize the Akkadian Empire not simply as an early state, but as a prototype of civilization itself. Its rise demonstrated the potential of coordination, its fall, the limits of centralization, its legacy, the resilience of knowledge. From the first inscribed clay tablet to the digital record, humanity's search for order and meaning traces its lineage to the scribes of Akkad. As the documentary closes, the narrative returns to the plains of Mesopotamia, to the quiet mounds that still conceal fragments of the first cities. Beneath their surface lies not only the memory of kings and gods, but the enduring truth that history is cumulative. The Akkadians, like their Sumerian forebears, began the long human dialogue between power and wisdom, between memory and renewal. Their civilization, once lost and now reclaimed, stands as both beginning and reminder that every modern advance rests upon ancient foundations, and that to study the first empire is to rediscover the origins of humanity's shared intellectual heritage. In the heart of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates still shape the land, the story of the Akkadian Empire finds its quiet conclusion. For 1,000 years have passed since Sargon's armies marched from Akkad, yet the echoes of his world remain. In the words we write, the laws we follow, and the structures that define civilization itself. From scattered villages along the riverbanks, humanity learned to build cities. From the coordination of irrigation and trade, it forged administration. And from the need to preserve memory, it invented writing, the clay tablet that first gave permanence to thought. The Akkadian world transformed these elements into an empire, extending order across distance and diversity. It was the first experiment in unity, a pattern that empires ever since have sought to emulate. Though the empire fell, its language endured. Akkadian became the lingua franca of diplomacy, the medium through which kingdoms communicated for over a millennium. Its scribes codified law, measured time, and recorded the rhythm of the stars. Each innovation carried forward, silently shaping the frameworks through which later societies understood the world. The rediscovery of Akkad and Sumer in modern times restored to humanity not only a forgotten past, but an awareness of continuity. It revealed that civilization did not begin with Greece or Rome, but in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, in the determination of early people to organize life, understand nature, and preserve knowledge. Today, as archaeologists translate the last undeciphered tablets and digital archives preserve their words, the dialogue between past and present continues. The Akkadian Empire endures not in monuments, but in systems, in governance, record-keeping, and the written word itself. The rivers still flow, as they did in Sargon's time, bearing the same waters that once nourished the first cities. Beneath their plains lie the remnants of humanity's earliest ambitions, the desire to create, to rule, to remember. And as long as that desire persists, the story of Akkad, the world's first empire, remains the opening chapter of civilization's long and unbroken history.